The scream came first, before anything else, cutting through the cold night air like a blade through silk. Elena Voss stood frozen at the center of the stone courtyard, hundreds of eyes fixed on her, and she knew in that instant that her life was about to change forever, though not in the way anyone standing there could have predicted. Her mother's voice rang out again, sharper this time, echoing off the ancient walls of Ravenswood Hall. Lady Mirren Voss did not shout often. She did not need to. Her words carried the kind of cold precision that cut deeper than any blade, and tonight, in front of the entire gathered pack, she chose her words like weapons. "Look at her," Mirren said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "My own daughter, 22 years old, and still nothing. No mark, no bond, no future. She will die alone, mateless, forgotten, while her sisters carry on our family's honor." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward through the crowd. Elena felt her face burn, felt every pair of eyes in the courtyard turn toward her, felt the weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the stone beneath her feet to open up and swallow her whole. But she stood there, spine straight, chin lifted, because if there was one thing Elena had learned in 22 years of living under her mother's shadow, it was that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. This was the night of the mating moon, the most sacred ceremony in the history of the sworn packs, held only once every 3 years. Wolves from every corner of the northern territories had traveled for weeks to be here, drawn by the promise of finding their fated mate beneath the full silver moon. Tonight, bonds would form, futures would be decided. And apparently, according to her mother, Elena's future had already been written in ash. Her 2 older sisters, Clara and Beatrice, stood a few feet away, dressed in gowns of deep emerald and midnight blue, their hair perfectly arranged, their expressions carefully composed into looks of practiced sympathy that did not reach their eyes. Elena had grown up watching her sisters receive praise for every small accomplishment, watching her mother's face light up whenever they entered a room, and watching that same face grow cold and distant whenever it turned toward her. It had not always been this way. Elena remembered fragments of a different childhood, moments when her mother's hand had been gentle, when her voice had carried warmth instead of ice. But something had changed when Elena's wolf failed to fully emerge during her first shift at 16. The pack healers had examined her for weeks, running test after test, and had finally delivered the verdict that would define the rest of her life. Elena's wolf was weak, underdeveloped. A defect, some had whispered, though never within her mother's hearing, because even Mirren's coldness toward her youngest daughter did not extend to allowing others to insult the Voss bloodline. But privately, in the halls of their home, in the quiet moments when no one else could hear, Mirren had made her feelings clear more times than Elena could count. A weak wolf meant a weak mate bond, or no bond at all. It meant shame. It meant a daughter who could never be paraded before other pack leaders as proof of the family's strength. Elena had spent 6 years trying to prove her mother wrong. She trained harder than her sisters ever had, waking before dawn to run through the forest until her legs burned, practicing her shift again and again, in the privacy of the training grounds long after everyone else had gone to bed. She had pushed herself past exhaustion more times than she could count, chasing some elusive proof that she was not broken, that she was not less than the wolves around her. None of it had mattered. Not to her mother. Not tonight. "Perhaps," Mirren continued, her voice dropping into something almost pitying, which somehow felt worse than her anger, "it would be kinder to simply accept that some wolves are not meant to be claimed. Elena, you may return to your room. There is no need for you to witness the bonding of wolves who actually have something to offer." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the crowd, though most of the assembled pack members looked away, uncomfortable, unwilling to meet Elena's eyes. Humiliation was one thing. Public humiliation, delivered by a mother in front of hundreds of witnesses, was something else entirely, and even those who did not particularly like Elena seemed to sense that this had crossed some invisible line. Elena did not move. She would not give her mother the satisfaction of watching her flee. "I will stay," Elena said, and though her voice shook slightly at first, it grew steadier with each word. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Mirren's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, A sudden hush fell over the entire courtyard, spreading outward like a wave. Elena felt it before she understood why. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, charged with something electric and undeniable. Every wolf in attendance turned toward the great stone archway at the far end of the courtyard, where a procession of figures had just appeared, moving with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. At the head of the procession walked a man Elena had heard about her entire life, but had never seen in person. King Draven Ashford, ruler of the Sworn Packs, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and by most accounts, the single most feared and respected wolf alive. He was younger than Elena had expected, though the stories had never mentioned his age, only his power. He moved like something carved from shadow and moonlight, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and unreadable expression. His eyes, even from a distance, held a startling shade of amber gold, the color of a wolf's eyes caught in firelight, and they swept across the courtyard with the kind of casual dominance that made every other wolf present instinctively lower their gaze. Elena had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. King Draven Ashford had inherited his throne at the age of 25, after his father's sudden death, and in the 7 years since, he had transformed the Sworn Packs from a loose collection of quarreling territories into the single most powerful alliance in the northern lands. He was said to be ruthless in battle, brilliant in strategy, and utterly without interest in matters of the heart. He attended these mating moon ceremonies as a formality, a duty owed to his position, nothing more. It was widely known that King Draven considered mate bonds to be a distraction, an unnecessary vulnerability for a ruler who could not afford weakness of any kind. He was not here to find a mate. He was here because tradition demanded his presence, and because a king who ignored tradition invited questions about his fitness to rule. Elena watched him move through the crowd, watched pack leaders bow their heads as he passed, watched the way even her own mother's expression shifted into something more careful, more deliberate, the moment his gaze swept in their direction. Whatever cruelty Mirren had been prepared to continue unleashing on her youngest daughter evaporated instantly in the presence of the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. And then, for reasons Elena would spend the rest of her life trying to understand, King Draven's gaze stopped moving. It found her. Elena felt it like a physical touch, a warmth that spread from the center of her chest outward, through her entire body, chasing away the cold humiliation of moments before. The amber eyes across the courtyard held hers, and for a moment, that felt impossibly long and impossibly short all at once. The rest of the world seemed to fall away. The whispers, the judgment, her mother's cruel words, all of it faded into background noise, drowned out by the sudden roaring silence that filled her ears. She did not understand what was happening. She only knew that something inside her, some part of her that had been dormant her entire life, had suddenly and violently woken up. Around her, murmurs began to spread through the crowd, low and urgent, as more and more wolves noticed where the king's attention had settled. Elena saw her mother's face transform, confusion giving way to something like alarm, and she saw her sisters exchange a quick, startled glance. King Draven's steps had slowed. He was no longer walking with the fluid, purposeful stride of a man attending to duty. He was moving toward her, and though his expression remained carefully neutral, there was something different in the way he carried himself now, something almost hesitant, as though he too did not entirely understand what was happening to him. Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it. She had spent her entire life being told she was destined for nothing, that her weak wolf meant a weak future, that she would never know the bond other wolves spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. She had made peace with that fate, or told herself she had, burying the quiet ache of loneliness beneath layers of forced indifference. And now the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories was walking toward her as though pulled by some invisible thread, and every instinct in her body was screaming that something extraordinary was about to happen. The elders standing near the ceremonial dais had gone completely still, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene with expressions ranging from disbelief to open shock. The mating moon ceremony was meant to unfold according to careful tradition, wolves presenting themselves in order of rank and status, The bonding ritual performed methodically, one pairing at a time, under the watchful guidance of the pack elders. What was happening now had no precedent. No one interrupted the ceremony's careful order. No one, least of all the king himself, simply abandoned protocol to cross a crowded courtyard toward an unranked wolf who moments earlier had been publicly declared unworthy of a mate. But that was exactly what was happening. Draven stopped a few feet in front of Elena, close enough now that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, could see the way his jaw tightened, as though he were fighting against some internal resistance, even as his body continued to close the distance between them. Up close, his presence was even more overwhelming, a kind of gravity that seemed to bend the air around him. "What is your name?" His voice was low, rougher than she had expected, carrying an edge of something that might have been confusion, or might have been wonder. "Elena," she managed, grateful her voice did not tremble. "Elena Voss." Something flickered across his face at the mention of her family name, some flash of recognition, though Elena could not read what it meant. Behind her, she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an ancient wolf named Alric, who had presided over mating moon ceremonies for longer than Elena had been alive, stepped forward hesitantly. "Your Majesty," Alric said carefully, "the ceremony has not yet reached this stage. If you wish to observe the ritual—" "I do not wish to observe it," Draven said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "I believe I am meant to participate in it." A collective gasp rippled through the courtyard. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, felt the impossible weight of hundreds of stares now fixed, not with pity or judgment, but with something closer to disbelief and awe. Alric's weathered face went pale. "Your Majesty, are you certain? The recognition ritual is not something to be entered into lightly, and if there is any doubt—" "I am certain," Draven said, and though his voice remained steady, Elena thought she detected the faintest crack beneath the surface, the sound of a man whose entire understanding of himself had just been upended in the space of a few heartbeats. The elders conferred in hurried, hushed tones, clearly unprepared for a king to demand participation in the recognition ritual outside the ceremony's traditional order, but no one dared refuse him. Within minutes, the ceremonial fire at the center of the courtyard was relit, and the ancient words of the bonding ritual began to echo through the night air, spoken in a language older than any of the wolves present, a language passed down through countless generations for exactly this purpose. Elena stood across from Draven, as the elders instructed them, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, close enough to see that his hands, resting at his sides, had curled into loose fists, as though he were bracing himself against something. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt something entirely different, a kind of quiet certainty settling into her bones, as though every lonely night of her life had been leading toward this single moment beneath the silver moon. The elder's voice rose and fell in ancient cadence, and as the final words of the ritual were spoken, Elena felt something click into place deep within her chest, a sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced, warm and undeniable and absolute. Across from her, Draven's entire body went rigid, his amber eyes widened, just slightly, and for one unguarded moment, Elena saw something raw and unshielded cross his face, before he forced his expression back into careful neutrality. The bond had recognized itself. The ritual had confirmed what his instincts had already told him the moment his gaze first found her across the crowded courtyard. Elena Voss, the daughter her own mother had just publicly declared destined to die alone and mateless, was the fated mate of King Draven Ashford, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. For a long, suspended moment, no one in the courtyard moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched thin and taut, filled with disbelief so profound it seemed to press physically against the air itself. And then Elena's mother made a sound, something between a gasp and a strangled cry, and the spell of silence shattered into 100 fragments of noise, gasps and whispers, and murmured disbelief rising all at once from the assembled crowd. Elena barely heard any of it. She was looking at Draven, and Draven was looking at her, and in his amber eyes, she saw something that looked almost like fear, though whether it was fear of the bond itself, or fear of what it might mean for a king who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability, she could not begin to guess. She only knew that for the first time in her entire life, she did not feel invisible. She did not feel unworthy. Standing beneath the silver light of the mating moon, bound by ancient magic to the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, Elena Voss felt, for one brief and shining moment, like she finally belonged somewhere. She had no way of knowing that this moment of belonging would not last, that the very forces which had brought her and Draven together beneath that ancient moon would soon threaten to tear them apart in ways far more devastating than anything her mother had ever said to her. She had no way of knowing that the true test of her strength had not yet even begun. For now, she simply stood in the courtyard, surrounded by shocked and murmuring faces, held in the gaze of a king who looked as stunned by fate as she felt, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that everything her mother had said about her was wrong. The fire crackled, the moon hung silver and full above them, and somewhere in the crowd, Lady Miran Voss stared at her youngest daughter with an expression Elena had never seen on her mother's face before, an expression that looked almost, impossibly, like fear. The elders moved quickly to restore some sense of order to the ceremony, ushering the stunned crowd back into their designated places, resuming the ancient rites for the other wolves waiting their turn beneath the moon. But the energy in the courtyard had shifted irrevocably. Every subsequent bonding felt like an afterthought, a formality performed in the shadow of what had just occurred between the king and the unranked daughter of the Voss family. Elena stood apart from the crowd now, flanked on one side by two of the king's personal guards, who had appeared almost instantly after the ritual's completion, their presence a silent but unmistakable signal that everything about her life had just changed, in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Draven himself had been pulled aside by Alric and two other senior elders, their voices low and urgent, though Elena could not make out the words from where she stood. She watched him from across the courtyard, this stranger who was somehow now bound to her by magic older than memory, and tried to steady the wild rhythm of her own heartbeat. He stood with his shoulders squared, listening to the elders with an expression that gave away nothing, though Elena thought she saw the faintest tension in the line of his jaw, the same tension she had noticed when he first crossed the courtyard toward her. "This is impossible," a voice hissed nearby, and Elena turned to find her mother standing a few feet away, her earlier composure completely shattered. Miran's eyes were wide, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, and for the first time in longer than Elena could remember, her mother looked genuinely rattled. There must be some mistake. The ritual must have malfunctioned. A king does not bond with... She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them regardless. A king does not bond with a weak wolf. A king does not bond with a daughter deemed unworthy just moments before by her own mother's public condemnation. "It is not a mistake," Elena said quietly, and she was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded, how steady, as though some new well of confidence had opened inside her the moment the bonding ritual completed. "You heard the elders confirm it yourself." Miran's mouth opened and closed several times, as though she could not decide which of a dozen different responses to unleash first. Behind her, Clara and Beatrice stood in stunned silence, their earlier expressions of careful sympathy replaced by something far more complicated, envy tangled together with disbelief, and, Elena thought, perhaps a flicker of something like respect they had never shown her before. "You understand what this means," Miran said finally, her voice dropping lower, urgent and sharp. "The king cannot simply claim a maid of low standing. There will be consequences. His advisors will never allow it. The other pack leaders will see it as weakness, an opportunity to challenge his authority. You have not gained anything tonight, Elena. You have only made yourself a target." The words should have frightened her. Perhaps, on any other night, they would have. But something had shifted inside Elena, in the moments since the ritual's completion. Some quiet reserve of strength she had not known she possessed, and she found herself looking at her mother, without the familiar flinch of anticipated cruelty. "Perhaps," Elena said. "Or perhaps you simply cannot accept that I might be worth something after all." Miran's face went through a rapid series of expressions, shock giving way to anger, giving way to something that might almost have been shame. Though it vanished so quickly, Elena could not be certain she had seen it at all. Her mother turned and walked away without another word, gathering Clara and Beatrice with a sharp gesture, disappearing into the thinning crowd. Elena watched them go, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel the familiar ache of rejection at her mother's retreat. She felt something closer to relief. Elena Voss. She turned to find Draven approaching, the elders trailing a respectful distance behind him, their expressions still carrying traces of the shock that had gripped the entire courtyard. Up close, he seemed even taller than she had realized, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a man carrying an enormous weight, though his voice, when he spoke, remained carefully measured. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "though I confess, I do not fully understand what happened tonight myself." "You are not the only one," Elena admitted. A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. "The bonding ritual is not something that can be forced or faked. What occurred between us tonight was genuine. The elders have confirmed it 3 times now, in case I harbored any doubts." "And do you? Harbor doubts?" He was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I did not come here tonight expecting to find a mate," he said finally. "I have spent 7 years as king, believing that a mate bond would be a liability I could not afford. My advisors will tell you the same. Rulers who allow themselves to be tied to another are rulers who can be manipulated, threatened, used as leverage against their own kingdoms." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she kept her expression composed. "Are you telling me this so that I understand what comes next, or are you telling me this because you intend to reject me?" The question hung between them, sharp and unavoidable, and Elena watched something complicated move across Draven's face, some internal struggle she could not quite name. "I am telling you this," he said slowly, "because I do not yet know the answer myself, and I think you deserve honesty rather than false comfort." It was not the answer she had hoped for, but it was, she recognized, more honest than anything her own mother had offered her in years. Elena nodded, forcing down the sting of disappointment that threatened to rise in her chest. "Then I suppose we will both find out together," she said. Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his amber eyes that she could not decipher, and then he extended his hand toward her, a formal gesture that seemed strangely old-fashioned, given everything that had just occurred between them. "Will you walk with me? There are things we should discuss, away from so many watching eyes." Elena hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. The contact sent a jolt of warmth up through her arm, the same electric sensation she had felt when their eyes first met across the crowded courtyard, and she understood in that moment that whatever the bond between them meant, whatever complications it might bring, it was not something either of them could simply ignore or wish away. They walked together toward the edge of the courtyard, away from the murmuring crowd, away from her mother's cold fury and the elders' careful scrutiny. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Voss allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Behind them, the mating moon ceremony continued, other wolves finding their bonds beneath the ancient silver light. But for Elena, the rest of the night blurred into a haze of half-formed questions and uncertain possibilities. She did not yet know that the hope blooming quietly in her chest would soon be tested in ways she could not begin to imagine, that the path ahead of her was not the simple fairy tale ending her heart wanted to believe in. She only knew that for the first time in her life, walking beside a king beneath a silver moon, she felt seen. And after 22 years of being told she was destined for nothing, that feeling alone was enough to make her believe, however briefly, that perhaps her mother had been wrong about everything. The night stretched on, filled with quiet conversation and careful, tentative honesty. 2 strangers bound together by ancient magic, neither of them had asked for, nor fully understood. Somewhere beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall, the greater consequences of what had happened that night were already beginning to stir, whispers traveling from pack to pack, reaching ears that would not welcome the news of a king bonded to an unranked wolf. But Elena did not yet know any of that. For now, there was only the cool night air, the fading sound of the ceremony behind them, and the steady warmth of Draven's hand in hers. A warmth that felt, impossibly, like the first solid ground she had stood on in her entire life. They stopped near a low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard, where the noise of the ceremony faded into a distant hum, and the night sky opened wide above them, scattered with more stars than Elena had ever bothered to count. Draven released her hand and stepped back slightly, putting a careful distance between them, as though he needed the space to think clearly. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not what the elders will tell me tomorrow, not what your mother said tonight. Tell me who you actually are." Elena considered the question for a long moment, unused to anyone asking it with genuine curiosity rather than pity or dismissal. "I am the youngest of 3 daughters," she said slowly. "My wolf came late, and when it finally did emerge, it was weaker than expected. The healers could never explain why. My mother decided early on that a weak wolf meant a weak daughter, and she has spent the last 6 years making sure I never forgot her opinion." "And your father?" "He died when I was 12. Hunting accident, though I have always wondered if that was the whole truth. My mother never speaks of it, and I learned early not to ask." Draven's expression flickered with something that looked almost like sympathy, though he did not offer the hollow comfort she had grown so tired of receiving from others. Instead, he simply nodded, as though filing the information away with careful consideration. "What about you?" Elena asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Everyone knows the stories, but I imagine the stories are not the whole truth either." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "My father died when I was 25. Poisoned, we believe, though we were never able to prove who was responsible. I inherited the throne with no preparation, and a kingdom full of wolves who doubted whether I was strong enough to hold it together. I spent the years since, proving them wrong, one difficult decision at a time. I have made choices I am not proud of. I have led wolves into battles that cost lives I still carry with me. I do not sleep well most nights." The honesty in his voice surprised her, the willingness to admit weakness to a stranger he had known for less than an hour. Elena found herself studying his face in the moonlight, searching for the ruthless king the stories described, and finding instead something more complicated, a man burdened by responsibilities he had never chosen, and duties he could never fully escape. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked. "If you believe a mate bond is a liability, why attend the ceremony at all?" "Tradition," he said simply. "My father always said that a king who ignores the old ways gives his enemies an easy weapon to use against him. I attend every mating moon ceremony. I stand at the edge of the courtyard. I observe. I have never once considered participating." "Until tonight." "Until tonight," he agreed, and something in his voice suggested he was still trying to reconcile the version of himself who had walked into this courtyard with careful indifference, and the version of himself standing here now, bound to a woman he had known for less than an hour. They talked for a long while after that, the conversation moving in unexpected directions, touching on small things, favorite places in the forest, the way Elena's wolf sometimes felt like a stranger trapped inside her own skin, the way Draven had never once, in 7 years of ruling, allowed himself a single day of genuine rest. There was an ease to the conversation that surprised them both, a comfort neither had expected to find in a stranger, and Elena felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin, slowly, to loosen. But even as the night wore on, even as something fragile and unfamiliar began to grow between them, Elena could not fully shake the memory of Draven's earlier words. Rulers who allow themselves to be tied to another are rulers who can be manipulated, threatened, used as leverage. The words sat uneasily in the back of her mind, a small shadow at the edge of an otherwise hopeful night. Eventually, one of the king's guards approached, informing Draven that the elders required his presence to formally close the ceremony. Draven's expression tightened briefly with something that looked like reluctance, before he nodded and turned back to Elena. "This is not something we will resolve tonight," he said. "There are conversations I need to have with my advisors, decisions that cannot be rushed. But I want you to know that whatever happens next, I do not take the bond between us lightly, regardless of what my head tells me about the dangers it might bring." Elena wanted to believe him. Standing there beneath the stars, the warmth of their earlier conversation still lingering in her chest, she wanted desperately to believe that this moment, this fragile beginning, would be enough to outlast whatever pressures waited for them beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall. I understand, she said, though privately she was not certain she did. Draven studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his amber eyes, and then he reached out and gently touched her cheek, a gesture so unexpected and so tender that Elena's breath caught in her throat. Whatever happens, he said quietly, know that tonight was not a mistake. And then he was gone, walking back toward the ceremonial dais where the elders waited, leaving Elena standing alone beneath the vast night sky, her heart caught somewhere between hope and quiet, unshakable fear. She did not know, as she watched him disappear into the crowd, that his words would soon be tested far sooner and far more brutally than either of them could have anticipated that night. She did not know that even now, in the shadowed corners of the courtyard, whispers were already spreading among the king's advisors, voices raising concerns about weak bloodlines and political vulnerability, and the dangerous precedent of a king bound to an unranked wolf. She only knew, standing alone beneath the silver moon, that for the first time in her entire life, someone had looked at her and seen something worth claiming, and whatever came next, she intended to hold on to that feeling for as long as she possibly could. The walk back to her family's quarters felt different than any walk she had ever taken through Ravenswood Hall. Wolves who had ignored her for years now watched her pass with open curiosity, their whispered conversations trailing after her like a fading echo. She did not know yet whether their attention carried respect or resentment, whether the story of tonight would be told as a triumph or a scandal. She only knew that everything had changed, and that somewhere beyond the walls of the hall, powerful wolves were already beginning to decide what that change would mean, decisions being made in rooms she could not enter, by voices she could not yet hear, that would shape the course of her entire future. For now, though, she allowed herself one small, quiet moment of happiness, a fragile ember of hope glowing in her chest as she climbed the stairs toward her room, the memory of amber eyes and a gentle touch lingering with her, long into the sleepless night that followed. The council chamber erupted into chaos before the sun had even fully risen over Ravenswood Hall. Draven stood at the head of the long stone table, watching his most trusted advisors argue among themselves with a ferocity he had rarely witnessed, even during discussions of war. "You cannot be serious," said Edmund Locke, the king's chief advisor, a wiry man with silver streaking through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had served Draven's father before serving Draven, and in 7 years, Edmund had never once raised his voice in this chamber. He was raising it now. "Your Majesty, the Voss family holds no significant rank within the sworn pacts. Their daughter has no political value, no strategic alliances to offer, no strength of blood to reinforce your position. This bond, if it stands, will be seen as a catastrophic weakness." "The bond is not a political calculation," Draven said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing against his resolve. "It is not something I chose." "With respect, Your Majesty, that is precisely the problem." Another voice cut in, this one belonging to General Callum Whitfield, the commander of the king's forces, a mountain of a man whose scarred face had seen more battles than any wolf currently living. "Every ruler in the northern territories will hear of this within days. Alpha Garrick of the Thornwood Pack has been searching for any excuse to challenge your authority since the day you took the throne. A weak mate bond gives him exactly the opening he needs." Draven's jaw tightened at the mention of Garrick's name. The Thornwood Pack had been a thorn in his side for years. Their alpha, a cunning and ambitious wolf, who had never fully accepted Draven's rule, biding his time for the perfect opportunity to strike. A vulnerable mate, one with no rank, no allies, no strength to defend herself, would be exactly the kind of weakness Garrick could exploit. "What would you have me do?" Draven asked, his voice carrying an edge of frustration he rarely allowed himself in front of his council. "The bond has already formed. It cannot simply be undone by wishing it away." "There is a way," Edmund said carefully, and something in his tone made the entire chamber go quiet. "A formal rejection. It is rare, and it carries consequences for both parties, but it is not without precedent. If performed correctly, it would sever the bond entirely, freeing you to seek a more advantageous match in the future." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended over Draven's head. He knew, of course, that rejection was possible. Every wolf knew the old stories, the tragic tales of bonds broken by pride or circumstance. the devastating toll such a rejection took on the rejected party. He had never imagined he would find himself considering it, not even a full day after the bond had formed. "And what consequences would I face?" Weaken asked quietly. "Some weakening, temporarily, until your wolf adjusts," Edmund admitted. "But it would pass. The girl, however, would suffer far more significantly. The rejection of a fated bond is devastating to the one rejected, particularly for a wolf already described as having a weak constitution. It could permanently damage her, physically and otherwise." Draven felt something cold settle in his stomach at the thought of causing Elena that kind of pain. He thought of her face beneath the moonlight, the careful hope in her eyes when she had asked him whether he intended to reject her, the honesty with which she had answered every question he had asked her. She had trusted him, even after everything her own mother had done to her that night, even after a lifetime of being told she was worthless. "I need time to think," Draven said finally. "Time is a luxury we may not have," General Callum said grimly. "Word of the bonding has already begun to spread. My scouts report that a messenger left for Thornwood territory before dawn. If Garrick learns of this before you have made your decision, he will act quickly to use it against you." The chamber fell into tense silence, broken only by the sound of Edmund pacing slowly along the length of the table, his expression troubled. "Your Majesty," Edmund said eventually, his voice softer now, though no less urgent. "I understand this is not merely a political decision to you. I saw the way you looked at her last night, but you are not simply a man who has found a mate. You are a king, responsible for the safety and prosperity of every wolf under your rule. If your position is weakened, if Garrick sees an opportunity to seize power, the consequences will extend far beyond your own heart. Packs will suffer, wolves will die. This is not a decision you can afford to make with sentiment alone." Draven closed his eyes briefly, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility settle over him once more, the same weight he had carried every single day since inheriting the throne at 25. He had built his entire reign on the principle of putting duty before personal desire, on making the hard choices that lesser rulers avoided. He had told himself for 7 years that a mate bond would only ever be a liability, a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. He had not expected fate to test that belief so soon, or so cruelly. "Give me until tomorrow," he said finally. "I will speak with the elders. I will consider every angle of this decision, but I will not be rushed into destroying something I do not yet fully understand." Edmund and Callum exchanged a look, clearly unsatisfied with the delay, but neither pressed further. They knew Draven well enough to recognize when his mind was set, even temporarily, and arguing further would accomplish nothing. As the council dispersed, Draven remained alone in the chamber, staring out through the narrow stone windows at the courtyard below, where the last remnants of last night's ceremony were being cleared away by pack servants. Somewhere within the walls of Ravenswood Hall, Elena Voss was likely waking up, perhaps allowing herself to hope that the fragile connection they had formed beneath the moon might actually last. He hated that his first instinct, upon waking this morning, had not been to seek her out, to continue the conversation they had begun the night before, but instead had been to walk into this chamber and listen to his advisors calculate the political cost of caring for another person. He hated that some traitorous part of him was already beginning to wonder whether Edmund was right, whether the safest path forward truly was the most painful one. He thought of his father, poisoned in his own bed by enemies who had sensed weakness and struck without mercy. He thought of the years he had spent proving to every doubting pack leader in the Northern Territories that he was strong enough, ruthless enough, unshakable enough to hold his throne. He had built an entire reputation on being untouchable, and now, less than a day after the mating moon ceremony, that reputation already felt fragile in a way it never had before. A knock at the chamber door pulled him from his thoughts. Ulrich, the elder who had presided over the previous night's ceremony, entered slowly, his weathered face carrying an expression Draven could not immediately read. "Your Majesty," Ulrich said, bowing his head slightly. "I understand your advisors have already made their concerns known." "They have," Draven admitted. "I imagine you carry your own opinion on the matter." Ulrich was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I have presided over more mating moon ceremonies than any elder currently living, Your Majesty. I have seen countless bonds form, some between wolves of equal rank, some between wolves separated by significant differences in status and power. But in all my years, I have never witnessed a recognition ritual respond as strongly, as instantly, as the one I witnessed between you and Elena Voss last night. The old texts speak of bonds like this only rarely, bonds so powerful that the ritual itself seems almost to demand recognition, regardless of circumstance or convenience. What are you telling me, Alric? I am telling you, Your Majesty, that whatever your advisors believe about political strategy, the bond between you and that young woman is not something to be dismissed lightly. The old stories warn that bonds of such strength, if rejected, carry consequences far beyond simple weakening. Some tales speak of curses, of misfortune following the one who breaks such a bond for the remainder of their days. Draven studied the old elder's face, searching for any sign of exaggeration or superstition, but found only genuine concern. You believe these old stories to be true? I believe, Alric said carefully, that a king who ignores the wisdom of those who came before him does so at his own peril. Whatever you decide, Your Majesty, decide it with full understanding of what you stand to lose, not merely what you stand to gain. Alric left him alone with those words, and Draven remained standing at the window for a long while afterward, the weight of the decision before him pressing down harder with every passing minute. He thought of Elena's steady voice as she stood before her mother, refusing to flee despite the public humiliation heaped upon her. He thought of the quiet strength beneath her uncertainty, the careful honesty with which she had answered every question he asked. He did not want to hurt her, but he also could not shake the fear that his advisors were right, that a bond born of fate rather than strategy would ultimately prove to be the very weakness his enemies had been waiting years to exploit. By the time the sun had fully risen over Ravenswood Hall, Draven had made no decision at all, caught between the pull of something he did not yet understand and the crushing weight of a duty he had spent his entire adult life honoring above all else. He did not know that even as he stood there, wrestling with his conscience, a rider from the Thornwood pack was already crossing the border into his territory, carrying word of the previous night's ceremony to an alpha who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opportunity. The clock, though none of them could yet see it clearly, had already begun to run out. Elena woke that morning to a household transformed. Servants who had barely acknowledged her presence for years now moved through the halls with careful deference, offering small bows as she passed, their eyes carrying a mixture of curiosity and calculation that made her deeply uneasy. Word of the bonding had clearly spread through every corner of Ravenswood Hall overnight, and Elena could feel the shift in how she was perceived, though she could not yet tell whether that shift would work in her favor. She found her mother in the family's private dining hall, seated at the head of the table with a cup of untouched tea in front of her, her expression unreadable in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten with unease. "Sit," Mirren said, without looking up. Elena hesitated, then took a seat across from her mother, bracing herself for whatever cruelty might follow. But instead of the cold condemnation she expected, Mirren simply studied her for a long moment, her expression difficult to read. "You understand," Mirren said finally, "that everything I said last night was for your own protection." Elena's disbelief must have shown clearly on her face, because Mirren's mouth tightened into a thin line. "You think me cruel," Mirren continued. "Perhaps I have been, but you do not understand what it means to raise a daughter the pack views as weak, to watch other mothers whisper behind their hands whenever your name is mentioned. I hardened you, because I hoped it would make you strong enough to survive what your life would otherwise have been." "That is not protection," Elena said quietly, her voice steadier than she expected. "That is cruelty dressed up as concern." Mirren's expression flickered, something almost like pain crossing her features before she smoothed it away. "Perhaps you are right. I will not pretend to have been a perfect mother, Elena, but I will tell you this. A king's affections are not the same as a king's commitment. Do not allow last night's events to convince you that your future is secured. Kings answer to councils, to advisors, to the demands of political survival. If those forces decide that bonding with you is too dangerous, they will find a way to undo what was done last night, regardless of what magic bound you together." The warning settled uneasily in Elena's chest, echoing the same fears that had kept her awake through most of the previous night. She thought of Draven's words beneath the moonlight, the honesty with which he had admitted his own uncertainty, and felt the fragile hope she had been nursing since the ceremony begin to waver. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked. For a moment, something almost gentle crossed Miran's face, an expression so unfamiliar that Elena barely recognized it. "Because if it happens, if the bond is broken, I do not want you to be blindsided by it. I have seen what rejection does to a wolf, Elena. I do not wish that particular pain upon you, whatever else you may believe about me." It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to genuine maternal concern her mother had shown her in 6 years, wrapped in the same cold pragmatism that defined every interaction between them. She did not know whether to feel comforted or more afraid than before. She spent the rest of the morning wandering the halls of Ravenswood Hall in a haze of uncertainty, unable to settle into any of her usual routines, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation from the previous night and her mother's ominous warning. She wanted to seek Draven out, to ask him directly what his council had decided, but propriety and a healthy sense of self-preservation kept her from marching into the royal wing uninvited. Instead, she found herself in the training grounds behind the hall, throwing herself into physical exertion, as she had done countless times before, whenever her thoughts grew too loud to bear. She ran the familiar forest path until her lungs burned, pushed through her shift again and again, testing the boundaries of a wolf that had always felt frustratingly incomplete. It was there, hours later, exhausted and sweat-soaked, that she encountered her sister Clara for the first time since the ceremony. "You look terrible," Clara said, though there was no malice in the observation, only a kind of careful curiosity that Elena had rarely heard from her sister. "I feel terrible," Elena admitted, too tired to maintain her usual guardedness. Clara sat down on a nearby stone bench, studying her younger sister with an expression Elena could not quite place. "I owe you an apology," Clara said finally. "I have never stood up for you against Mother. Not once. Not even when I knew what she said to you was wrong. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. But watching what happened last night, watching Mother humiliate you in front of hundreds of wolves, only for the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories to prove her spectacularly wrong within minutes, I realized how cowardly my silence has been all these years." Elena stared at her sister, unsure how to respond to an apology she had never expected to receive. "Why now?" "Because I am ashamed," Clara said simply. "And because whatever happens next, whether this bond survives or whether it falls apart under political pressure, I do not want to be the kind of sister who only speaks kindly to you once you have proven your worth to everyone else. You deserved better from this family, long before last night, Elena. That should never have depended on a king recognizing something the rest of us should have seen all along. It was not enough to erase 6 years of quiet cruelty, of watching her sisters bask in praise she never received. But it was something, a small crack of warmth in a family that had felt like frozen stone for as long as Elena could remember. She found herself blinking back unexpected tears, overwhelmed by an emotion she could not fully name. "Thank you," she said quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, and for the first time in longer than Elena could remember, she felt something resembling genuine connection with her sister. But even that small comfort could not fully quiet the anxious voice in the back of her mind, the one that kept returning to her mother's warning, to the uncertainty in Draven's eyes when she had asked him whether he intended to reject her. Meanwhile, far beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall, in the shadowed halls of Thornwood Keep, Alpha Garrick Thorn received the messenger's report with an expression of barely contained delight. He had waited 7 long years for exactly this kind of opening, watching Draven Ashford consolidate power with a precision and ruthlessness that had left the other pack leaders too intimidated to challenge him directly. But a king weakened by an unworthy mate bond, a king whose advisors were already whispering about political vulnerability, that was a king who could finally be tested. "Gather the council," Garrick told his second-in-command, a cruel smile spreading across his weathered face. "It seems our patient waiting has finally been rewarded." Word traveled quickly through the Northern Territories in the days that followed. carried by messengers and traders and wandering wolves eager to share the scandalous tale of a king bonded to an unranked, publicly humiliated daughter of a minor family. In some territories, the story was told with sympathy, wolves moved by the unlikely romance between a powerful king and an overlooked young woman. In others, particularly within the Thornwood territories and among Draven's rivals, the story was told with barely concealed glee, evidence at last that the untouchable king had a weakness that could be exploited. Draven remained cloistered with his advisors for 2 full days following the ceremony, wrestling with a decision that felt increasingly impossible to make cleanly. Every path forward seemed to carry devastating consequences, either for his kingdom or for the woman he had bonded with beneath the mating moon, and with each passing hour, the pressure from his council intensified. On the evening of the second day, as Draven stood once again at the window of the council chamber, watching the sun set over territories he had spent 7 years protecting, Edmund entered quietly, his expression grave. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, "Alpha Garrick has requested an audience. He claims to wish to discuss trade agreements between our territories, but I suspect his true purpose is far less benign." Draven closed his eyes briefly, feeling the walls closing in around him from every direction. "Grant the audience," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of a decision he had not yet made, but could feel drawing inexorably closer. "Let us see exactly what our enemies believe they have gained." Outside the chamber walls, unaware of the political storm gathering around her, Elena Voss continued to hold on to the fragile hope that had bloomed in her chest beneath the silver moon, unaware that the coming days would test that hope more severely than she could possibly imagine. Alpha Garrick arrived at Ravenswood Hall the following afternoon, with an entourage far larger than any simple trade discussion warranted, a clear and deliberate show of confidence, designed to unsettle. Draven received him in the formal audience chamber, seated upon the raised stone throne that had belonged to generations of Ashford kings before him, his expression carefully composed into the same unreadable mask he had perfected over 7 years of rule. Garrick was a broad-shouldered wolf, with graying hair and pale gray eyes that missed nothing, his smile carrying the particular warmth of a predator who believed he had already won. He bowed with exaggerated formality, the gesture carrying an undertone of mockery that Draven did not miss. "Your Majesty," Garrick said smoothly, "I trust the mating moon ceremony proved eventful." The comment hung in the air, deliberately provocative, and Draven felt Edmund tense beside him, though he kept his own expression carefully neutral. "It proved memorable," Draven said evenly. "Though I suspect you have not traveled all this way merely to discuss my personal affairs." "Of course not," Garrick said, his smile widening slightly. "I came to discuss trade routes along our shared border, matters of genuine importance to both our territories. Though I confess, the rumors reaching Thornwood have been difficult to ignore. A king bonded to an unranked daughter of a minor family, a wolf described, if the stories are accurate, as possessing a weak and underdeveloped bloodline. Such news travels quickly, Your Majesty, and travels far." "Rumors have a tendency to exaggerate," Draven replied, his voice carrying a warning edge that few wolves would have dared to ignore, though Garrick seemed entirely unbothered. "Perhaps," Garrick said, "though I have found, in my experience, that rumors of this particular nature rarely arise from nothing. And I must confess, Your Majesty, it concerns me. Not for my own sake, of course, but for the stability of our alliance. The other pack leaders look to your strength as an example, a guarantee that the sworn packs remain united under capable leadership. Any perceived weakness in that leadership, whether real or merely rumored, invites doubt. Doubt invites division. Division, as you well know, has historically preceded conflict among our territories. The threat was thinly veiled beneath the language of diplomatic concern, and Draven felt the full weight of it settle over him, confirming every fear his advisors had raised over the past 2 days. Garrick was not here to discuss trade routes. He was here to test the waters, to gauge exactly how vulnerable Draven had become, and to plant the seeds of doubt that would grow into open challenge if given enough time. "You need not concern yourself with matters beyond your own territory," Draven said coldly. "My leadership remains as it has always been." "Of course, Your Majesty," Garrick said, bowing his head with false deference. "I meant no offense. I merely wished to express my concern as a fellow leader within the sworn packs." Though I would be remiss if I did not mention that several other pack leaders have expressed similar concerns to me privately in recent days. It seems the news of your bonding has traveled farther and faster than perhaps you anticipated. After Garrick's audience concluded, having accomplished exactly what he had intended, without ever directly threatening anything at all, Draven remained seated on his throne for a long while, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him with crushing force. "You see now what we are facing," Edmund said quietly, once the chamber had emptied. "Garrick has already begun testing the Alliance's confidence in you. If the bond stands, if word continues to spread that the King's mate is weak and unworthy, other pack leaders will begin to question your judgment. Some may even begin to quietly align themselves with Thornwood, hedging their loyalty in case Garrick decides to act on the opportunity you have handed him." "I handed him nothing," Draven said sharply. "I did not choose this bond." "With respect, Your Majesty, it does not matter whether you chose it. Perception is everything in matters of power, and the perception spreading through the northern territories, whether fair or not, is that the once untouchable King Draven Ashford has revealed a significant vulnerability." Draven closed his eyes, feeling the full crushing weight of his position settle over him like a physical burden. He thought of Elena, of the quiet strength in her eyes despite years of cruelty from her own family, of the honesty with which she had spoken to him beneath the moon, admitting fears and hopes she had likely never shared with anyone else. He did not want to hurt her. But as Garrick's veiled threats echoed in his mind, as he imagined the northern territories fracturing into conflict, wolves dying in a war born from perceived weakness rather than genuine cause, he felt his resolve beginning to crack under the accumulated pressure. "I need to speak with her," Draven said finally, rising from his throne. "Before I make any decision, I owe her that much honesty." Edmund said nothing, though his silence carried its own kind of warning, a reminder that time was rapidly running out, that every day the bond remained unresolved was another day Garrick and wolves like him had to strengthen their position against a king they now believed had shown his first true weakness. As Draven made his way through the halls of Ravenswood Hall that evening, searching for Elena amid the growing shadows of dusk, he could not shake the feeling that whatever decision he ultimately made, someone was going to be devastated by the outcome. He had spent 7 years believing that duty and personal happiness could never coexist for a king in his position. He had never imagined how painfully that belief would be tested, or how much it would cost the one person who had looked at him, for one brief and shining night, without fear or expectation, but simply with hope. He found her eventually in the garden behind the eastern wing, sitting alone beneath a sprawling old oak tree, her expression distant and troubled in the fading evening light. She looked up as he approached, and something in her eyes, a flicker of cautious hope, quickly tempered by wariness, told him that she had already sensed the shift in the winds around them, that whatever fragile happiness she had allowed herself to feel over the past 2 days had already begun to erode beneath the weight of uncertainty. "You have made a decision," she said quietly, not quite a question. Draven stopped a few feet away from her, the words he had rehearsed on his way to find her suddenly feeling inadequate against the raw vulnerability in her expression. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I fear I am running out of time to avoid making one." Elena studied his face for a long moment, and Draven watched something harden behind her eyes, a wall rising to protect herself against whatever blow might be coming, the same defensive strength she had likely built over years of disappointment from the people who were supposed to love her most. "Then tell me honestly," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Draven could see beneath the surface. "What are you afraid of?" It was, Draven realized, exactly the right question, and exactly the one he had been avoiding asking himself for 2 entire days. Draven sat down on the stone bench across from her, the distance between them feeling suddenly vast, despite being only a few feet, and told her everything. He told her about Edmund's warnings, about General Callum's concerns for the safety of the packs, about Garrick's veiled threats delivered with a predator's smile just hours earlier. He told her about the old fear that had shaped every decision of his reign, the fear that had followed him since watching his own father die from poison delivered by enemies who sensed weakness and struck without hesitation. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, though Draven could see the careful way she absorbed each piece of information, weighing it, measuring the shape of the decision that was slowly closing in around both of them. "So you believe," she said finally, when he had finished, "that rejecting me would protect your kingdom?" "I do not know what I believe," Draven admitted, and the honesty in his own voice surprised him. "I know what my advisors believe. I know what 7 years of ruling has taught me about the cost of vulnerability. But I also know what I felt beneath that moon 2 nights ago, and I do not know how to reconcile those two truths." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening garden, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that Draven found he admired even as it broke something inside his chest. "I have spent my entire life being told I was not enough," she said. "Not strong enough, not worthy enough, not deserving of anything good. I came to this ceremony expecting nothing, and for one night, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, for the first time, someone saw something in me worth claiming. If you decide that political survival matters more than that, I will not beg you to change your mind. I have too much respect for myself left, even after everything, to spend my life begging for scraps of affection from people who see me as a liability." The words struck him harder than any blade could have, precise and honest, and utterly without self-pity, and Draven found himself staring at this woman who had endured a lifetime of cruelty with more grace and quiet dignity than most wolves he had known his entire life. "I am not asking you to beg," he said quietly. "I am trying to find a way to protect both my kingdom and the possibility of something I did not know I wanted until 2 nights ago." "Then find it quickly," Elena said, rising to her feet, her expression carrying a mixture of sorrow and resolve that told him she had already begun preparing herself for the worst. "Because I refuse to spend another moment of my life waiting to be told I am not worth the risk." She left him alone in the garden as darkness settled fully over Ravenswood Hall, and Draven remained there for a long while afterward, staring up at the same stars that had witnessed their bonding beneath the mating moon, feeling the crushing weight of an impossible decision pressing down harder with every passing hour. He did not yet know that the decision would be taken partially out of his hands within days, that the political pressure building around him would soon reach a breaking point that no amount of careful deliberation could contain. He only knew, sitting alone in the cooling night air, that whatever choice he made, he was about to hurt someone who had already been hurt far too much in her short life, and that the weight of that knowledge might prove heavier than any crown he had ever worn. 3 more messengers arrived at Ravenswood Hall within a single week, each carrying word from a different pack leader, each message phrased with careful diplomatic language that could not fully disguise the same underlying question. Was the king's bond a sign of weakness the northern territories should exploit, or was it something the other packs should quietly support, before Thornwood gained too much influence over the growing uncertainty? Elena felt the shift in atmosphere throughout Ravenswood Hall with every passing day, a tension that seemed to thicken the air itself, wolves speaking in hushed voices whenever she passed, their eyes carrying a wariness that had not been there even during the worst years of her mother's public disapproval. She had gone from invisible to the center of a political storm in the space of a single night, and the weight of that transformation pressed down on her more heavily with each passing hour. She had not seen Draven since their conversation in the garden 4 days earlier. He remained cloistered with his advisors for hours at a time, and though she told herself his absence meant nothing more than the demands of his position, a small, persistent voice in the back of her mind whispered that his silence carried a different kind of message entirely. It was Alric who finally sought her out on the 5th morning, finding her in the library where she had taken to spending her mornings, losing herself in old texts about pack history and ancient bloodlines, anything to distract her mind from the anxious circling of her own thoughts. "Elena," Alric said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of an old wolf, whose joints had long since stopped cooperating easily. "I wonder if I might ask you some questions about your family history." Elena set down the book she had been reading, curious despite the anxiety still churning in her stomach. "Of course. Your father," Alric said carefully. "Do you know much about his bloodline, his family origins?" Elena frowned, searching her memory for fragments of information she had never had much reason to examine closely. "Very little. He rarely spoke of his family. My mother always said he came from a minor territory to the far north, though I never met any relatives from that side." Alric nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I have spent the past several days researching the strength of the recognition ritual that bound you and King Draven together. Such an instant and powerful bond is exceedingly rare, Elena, and in my studies of the old texts, I have found that bonds of this particular strength often occur between wolves who carry certain ancient bloodlines, lineages that have grown scarce over the centuries but which, when present, produce wolves of extraordinary latent strength, even if that strength does not manifest in the usual ways during adolescence. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a strange mixture of hope and confusion. You believe my wolf is not actually weak? I believe, Alric said carefully, that your wolf may simply be suppressed, rather than weak. There is a difference, though the symptoms can appear similar to those without specialized knowledge of ancient bloodlines. Suppression can occur for many reasons. Emotional trauma, prolonged psychological distress. A wolf, raised in an environment of constant fear or rejection, sometimes builds walls around its own strength, without even realizing it is doing so, a kind of unconscious self-protection that prevents the wolf from ever reaching its true potential. The implications settled over Elena slowly, heavy and staggering. 6 years of being told she was weak, of internalizing her mother's cruel judgments as unshakable fact, and now an ancient elder was suggesting that the weakness itself might have been created by the very treatment she had endured, rather than being some inherent flaw in her nature. I do not know what to do with that information, Elena admitted quietly. You need not do anything with it immediately, Alric said gently. I only wished you to know, regardless of what happens with the political situation surrounding your bond, that you are not the wolf your mother has spent years insisting you are. Whatever the council decides, whatever pressures weigh upon the king in the coming days, that truth remains yours to carry forward. Alric's words lingered with her long after he had left the library, a small ember of possibility glowing amid the growing darkness of her uncertainty about Draven's decision. She thought of her training in the forest, the countless hours spent pushing against the limits of a wolf that had always felt frustratingly incomplete, and wondered, for the first time, whether those limits had ever truly been as fixed as she had believed. That afternoon, summoned by a formal request delivered through one of the palace servants, Elena found herself standing before the full council of pack elders for the first time since the ceremony, called to answer questions about her bloodline, her upbringing, and her fitness to potentially stand beside a king. The chamber felt cold and imposing, the elders arranged in a semicircle of stern, weathered faces that studied her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open skepticism. Miss Voss, said an elder Elena did not recognize. An older woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe knot. The council has convened to discuss the unusual circumstances of your bonding with King Draven. Given the significant political implications of this bond, we must ask you directly, do you believe yourself capable of standing beside a king, of representing the sworn packs with the strength and dignity such a position requires? The question hung in the chamber, loaded with unspoken judgment, and Elena felt the familiar sting of doubt rise in her chest, the echo of her mother's voice from years of cruel dismissal. But she thought of Ulrich's words from that morning, of the possibility that her weakness had been manufactured rather than inherent, and she found something steadier rising up beneath the doubt, a quiet defiance that had been building inside her for longer than she had realized. I have spent 6 years being told I was not capable of anything at all, Elena said, her voice carrying further than she expected in the stone chamber. I have been publicly humiliated by my own mother, dismissed by my own community, and treated as though my worth was determined entirely by the strength of a wolf that manifested during my 16th year. I do not know what capabilities I truly possess, because I have never once been given a fair opportunity to discover them without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me before I even begin. Murmurs rippled through the assembled elders, and Elena pressed forward, emboldened by her own honesty. But I know this, she continued. I know that I did not ask for this bond, and I did not ask to become the center of a political crisis that threatens to divide the sworn packs. If the council believes that my presence beside the king represents a genuine threat to the safety and stability of the Northern Territories, then I would ask that decision be made honestly, on the basis of clear evidence, rather than on assumptions built from years of cruelty I did not deserve and could not control. The chamber fell into stunned silence following her words, several of the elders exchanging surprised glances, clearly not expecting such a direct and unflinching response from a young wolf they had gathered to interrogate. Elena stood her ground, refusing to lower her gaze despite the pounding of her own heart, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her words had shifted something in the room, however slightly. The elder woman who had first questioned her studied Elena for a long moment before finally speaking again, her expression somewhat softer than before. "That was well said, Miss Voss. The council will take your words under advisement as we continue our deliberations." It was not the ringing endorsement Elena had hoped for, but it was, she recognized, more respect than she had received from any formal gathering of authority figures in her entire life, and she left the chamber that afternoon carrying a small, fragile sense of pride that she had not felt in longer than she could remember. But pride alone could not shield her from the growing storm that continued to build around her in the days that followed. That evening, as she made her way back toward her family's quarters, she overheard a conversation between two palace guards that stopped her in her tracks, hidden in the shadow of a stone archway. "They say the council is leaning toward recommending rejection," one guard said quietly to the other. "Too dangerous, given Thornwood's posturing. Alpha Garrick has apparently begun quietly meeting with two other pack leaders, testing whether they might support a challenge to the king's authority if the bond stands." "A shame," the other guard replied. "The girl seemed decent enough, from what I've heard. Cannot imagine what a formal rejection would do to her, given how weak her wolf is said to be." Elena remained frozen behind the archway long after the guards had moved on, their words settling over her like a physical weight, confirming every fear that had been building in the back of her mind since her conversation with Draven in the garden. The council was leaning toward rejection. Whatever fragile hope she had allowed herself to nurture over the past several days now felt impossibly fragile, a candle flame flickering against a wind that showed no signs of dying down. She thought of her mother's warning from days earlier. A king's affections are not the same as a king's commitment. She thought of Draven's own admitted uncertainty in the garden, the honest fear in his voice as he described the pressures closing in around him. She had told him she refused to spend another moment of her life waiting to be told she was not worth the risk, and yet here she was, doing exactly that, waiting in agonized uncertainty for a decision that would determine the entire shape of her future. That night, unable to sleep, Elena made her way to the training grounds behind the hall, seeking the familiar comfort of physical exertion to quiet the storm of anxious thoughts circling endlessly through her mind. The moon hung high and bright above her, not quite as full as it had been on the night of the ceremony, but bright enough to cast long silver shadows across the empty training yard. She began to run, pushing her body harder than she had in days, chasing the same elusive strength she had been chasing her entire life. And as she ran, something Alric had said that morning echoed through her mind, the suggestion that her weakness might have been built rather than inherited, a wall constructed by years of trauma rather than a genuine flaw in her nature. She stopped in the center of the training yard, breathing hard, and closed her eyes, reaching inward toward the part of herself that had always felt distant and incomplete, the wolf that had never fully emerged despite years of desperate effort. For the first time, instead of pushing against that inner barrier with frustration and self-doubt, she tried something different. She tried to understand it, to ask it gently what it needed, rather than demanding it simply appear. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden transformation, no burst of overwhelming power, but she felt something, a faint warmth deep within her chest, subtle but undeniable, like a door that had been sealed shut for years creaking open by the smallest fraction of an inch. It was not much, but it was something, and in the midst of the political storm threatening to tear apart everything she had begun to hope for, that small, faint warmth felt like the first genuine evidence that perhaps Alric had been right about her all along. She did not yet know that within days, that evidence would be tested in the cruelest way possible, that the fragile hope blooming within her would soon collide directly with the crushing weight of political necessity, in a confrontation that would leave her standing alone before the entire pack once again, though this time, the humiliation would come not from her mother, but from the very king who had claimed her as his fated mate beneath the silver light of the mating moon. For now, She simply stood in the moonlit training yard, one hand pressed against her own chest, feeling the faint warmth of something ancient and long suppressed beginning, however slowly, to stir back to life. Draven found her there, in the training yard, standing alone beneath the moon, with her hand pressed against her chest, and he stopped at the edge of the clearing, reluctant to interrupt whatever private moment he had stumbled upon. He had been unable to sleep either, his mind circling the same impossible decision that had consumed every waking hour since Garrick's visit, and something had drawn him toward the training grounds, some instinct he did not fully understand. "You should be resting," he said quietly, finally announcing his presence. Elena turned, startled, though her expression settled quickly into something more guarded once she recognized him. "So should you," she replied. "Though I suspect neither of us has managed much rest lately." He crossed the distance between them slowly, stopping a respectful few feet away, and studied her face in the moonlight, searching for some sign of the anger or despair he half expected to find there after days without contact. Instead, he found something calmer, more resolute, though he could see the effort it took her to maintain that composure. "I have not been avoiding you deliberately," he said. "The council has demanded nearly every waking hour, and I did not wish to seek you out until I had something more certain to offer than continued uncertainty." "And do you?" Elena asked. "Have something certain to offer?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched the internal struggle play out across his features, the same battle she had witnessed in the garden days earlier, seemingly no closer to resolution now than it had been then. "The council believes rejection is the safer path," he admitted finally, the words clearly costing him something significant to speak aloud. "Garrick continues to test the Alliance's confidence in my leadership. 2 other pack leaders have begun quietly communicating with Thornwood, hedging their loyalty. Edmund believes that every day the bond remains unresolved, the risk of open conflict grows." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest, though she had already overheard enough from the guards to prepare herself for this confirmation. "And what do you believe?" "I believe," Draven said slowly, "that I have spent 7 years telling myself that duty must always come before personal desire, that a king who allows himself vulnerability invites destruction upon everyone he is sworn to protect. I have built my entire reign on that principle, and yet standing here, looking at you, I find myself unable to fully believe it anymore, even as every rational argument in my council chamber insists that I should." The honesty in his voice struck her harder than any careful political language could have, and Elena felt the careful walls she had been building around her own heart begin to waver, despite every instinct warning her against such vulnerability. "Then what happens now?" she asked. "I do not know," Raven admitted. "But I know that whatever decision I ultimately make, I owe it to you to make it honestly, not hidden behind council chambers and political calculations, but standing before you directly, so that whatever pain that decision causes, you at least know it came from me, and not from whispered rumors and overheard conversations." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of the calculating ruler her mother had warned her about, and found instead only exhaustion and genuine conflict, a man caught between 2 versions of himself that he did not yet know how to reconcile. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "More than you probably realize." They stood together in the moonlit training yard for a while longer, the silence between them heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. 2 people bound by ancient magic and threatened by mundane political calculation, each searching for some path forward that neither could yet clearly see. "Alric believes my wolf is not weak," Elena said eventually, breaking the silence. "He believes it has been suppressed by years of trauma, that there is an ancient bloodline in my father's family that might explain the strength of our bonding ritual." Draven's expression shifted with genuine interest, some of the exhaustion lifting from his features. "That would explain a great deal, if true. The strength of our recognition ritual was unlike anything the elders have witnessed in generations." "I do not know if it changes anything," Elena admitted. "The council still fears the political optics of my status, regardless of what latent strength I might eventually develop, but it changes something in how I see myself, at least." "That alone is not nothing," Draven said, and something gentle crossed his expression as he said it, a softness Elena had not seen from him since the night of the ceremony. They talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting into smaller, less fraught territory. And for a brief window of time, Elena allowed herself to forget the political storm gathering around them, allowed herself to simply exist in the quiet comfort of his company. But as the night wore on, and the moon began its slow descent toward the horizon, the weight of their unresolved circumstances settled back over both of them, impossible to ignore for long. "I should return to my quarters," Elena said finally, though some part of her was reluctant to end the conversation. "The council will likely summon you again at first light." Draven nodded, though he made no move to leave immediately, studying her face with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her pause. "Whatever happens in the coming days, I want you to know that meeting you, bonding with you beneath that moon, has not been a mistake, regardless of what political consequences follow. I do not say that lightly." Elena felt something tighten in her throat, torn between the fragile comfort of his words and the growing certainty that comfort alone would not be enough to shield her from whatever decision the council eventually forced upon him. "I hope you remember saying that," she said quietly, "whatever you ultimately decide." She left him standing alone in the training yard, the moon casting long shadows across the empty space where they had stood together, and made her way back toward her quarters, with a heart caught between hope and a growing, unshakable dread. The following morning brought no relief from the mounting tension gripping Ravenswood Hall. Draven was summoned before the full council at dawn, and this time, the atmosphere in the chamber carried none of the careful deliberation that had characterized their earlier discussions. Edmund's expression was grim, General Callum's jaw set with barely contained urgency, and even Alric, usually the calmest voice among the elders, wore an expression of genuine concern. "Your Majesty," Edmund said without preamble, "we have received word this morning that Alpha Garrick has called for a gathering of pack leaders within the fortnight, ostensibly to discuss matters of regional trade and security. Given recent events, we believe this gathering is a thinly veiled attempt to formally challenge the stability of your reign, using the bond as evidence of weakened leadership." "He would not dare openly challenge my authority," Draven said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized the hollowness in his own certainty. "He would not need to challenge you openly," General Callum said grimly. "He need only sow enough doubt among the other pack leaders that some begin to question whether your continued rule serves their interests. A gathering like this, framed carefully, could accomplish exactly that, without a single direct confrontation." The chamber fell into tense silence, and Draven felt the walls of his careful deliberation finally beginning to close in completely, the space for further delay narrowing with each passing hour. He thought of Elena's words from the night before, her insistence that whatever decision he made, it should come from him directly, honestly, rather than hidden behind political calculation. He thought, too, of his promise to her, that bonding with her had not been a mistake regardless of what followed. He wanted desperately to believe that promise could withstand the pressure now bearing down on him from every direction. "I need until the gathering to make my final decision," Draven said finally, his voice carrying more authority than he currently felt. "I will not be rushed into a choice of this magnitude by Garrick's manipulations alone." Edmund and Callum exchanged a glance heavy with concern, but neither pressed further, recognizing the same immovable resolve in Draven's voice that had carried him through 7 difficult years of rule. But as the council meeting concluded, and Draven found himself once again alone with his thoughts, he could not shake the growing certainty that whatever decision he ultimately made, the fortnight ahead would test every principle he had built his reign upon, and that the cost of that test would fall most heavily, not upon himself, but upon the woman who had done nothing to deserve the storm now gathering around her. Elena, unaware of the precise details of the council's mounting urgency, but keenly attuned to the shifting atmosphere throughout the hall, spent the following days continuing her quiet exploration of the strength Alric had suggested lay dormant within her. Each night, she returned to the training grounds, coaxing that faint warmth in her chest a little further toward the surface, discovering slowly, painstakingly, that her wolf was not nearly as weak as 6 years of cruel judgment had convinced her to believe. But even as that private strength began to grow, the political storm surrounding her continued to build toward its inevitable breaking point, and neither Elena nor Draven could yet see clearly just how devastating that breaking point would prove to be. 10 days after Garrick's audience, the pack leaders of the Northern Territories began arriving at Ravenswood Hall for the gathering he had called, filling the halls with unfamiliar faces and the low hum of political tension that seemed to press against every wall of the ancient stone building. Elena watched from a distance as the visiting alphas were welcomed with careful ceremony, noting the particular attention paid to Garrick himself, who moved through the halls with the confident ease of a wolf who believed the coming days would deliver exactly the outcome he had been engineering for weeks. Draven had grown increasingly distant over those 10 days, consumed by preparations for the gathering, and though he had sought her out twice more in quiet, stolen moments, each conversation carried a heavier weight than the last, as though he were slowly steeling himself for something he had not yet found the courage to name aloud. Elena recognized the signs, the careful distance he maintained even in their closest moments, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on her with an expression that looked uncomfortably close to grief. She had continued her private training in the evenings, and the results, while still modest, had begun to feel undeniable. Her shifts came more easily now, her control sharper, her wolf responding to her will with a confidence she had never experienced before. Alric, who had taken to observing her progress with quiet fascination, seemed increasingly convinced that his theory about her suppressed bloodline held merit, though he cautioned that true strength would take considerably more time to fully develop. "Whatever happens in the coming days," Alric told her one evening, watching her complete a particularly difficult sequence of shifts in the training yard, "do not let anyone convince you that what you are discovering within yourself is not real. I have watched wolves train for decades without achieving the kind of progress you have made in a matter of weeks." Elena appreciated his words, though they did little to ease the anxious dread that had settled permanently in her stomach as the day of the pack leaders' gathering drew closer. She had overheard enough fragments of conversation among the palace staff to understand that the gathering would likely determine the fate of her bond with Draven, one way or another, and no amount of private strength could fully shield her from the fear of what that determination might bring. The night before the formal gathering was set to begin, Elena found herself once again in the garden behind the eastern wing, seeking the quiet solace of the old oak tree where she and Draven had spoken so honestly weeks earlier. She had not expected to find him there, but, as she rounded the familiar path, she found him already seated beneath the tree, his expression heavy with a burden she could see clearly, even in the dim evening light. "I did not expect to find you here," she said, settling onto the bench across from him. "I could not stay in the council chamber a moment longer," Draven admitted. "Edmund and Callum have spent the entire evening rehearsing arguments for tomorrow's gathering, and I find I can no longer bear listening to my own fate discussed, as though it were merely a matter of strategic calculation." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for some sign of the decision she feared was coming, and found only exhaustion and a kind of quiet sorrow that made her chest ache with dread. "You have decided something," she said quietly. It was not a question. Draven was silent for a long moment, and when he finally looked up to meet her eyes, the raw pain visible in his expression told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke a single word. "Tomorrow, before the assembled pack leaders," he said, his voice carrying a rough, broken quality she had never heard from him before, "Edmund and Callum believe I must demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that I remain firmly in control of my own reign, unshaken by rumor or political manipulation. They believe the only way to accomplish that decisively enough to silence Garrick's growing influence is to formally and publicly reject the bond between us, removing any perceived vulnerability before it can be further exploited." The words landed like physical blows, and Elena felt the careful composure she had been building for weeks begin to crack under their weight. "And do you agree with them?" Draven's silence stretched long and agonizing, and in that silence, Elena found her answer far more clearly than any words could have provided. "I do not know how to protect both my kingdom and what has grown between us," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have spent 10 days searching for another path, and I have found none that does not risk the safety of every wolf under my protection." Elena rose slowly to her feet, her entire body trembling with a mixture of grief and something harder, something that had been quietly building within her for weeks, alongside the growing strength of her wolf. "Then you have already made your decision," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, though it cost her everything to keep it that way. You simply have not yet found the courage to say it plainly. Draven looked up at her, and for one unguarded moment, Elena saw the full weight of his anguish laid bare across his features. A king caught between duty and desire, finding no path forward that did not demand devastating sacrifice. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I am so sorry, Elena." She did not respond. She turned and walked away from him, back toward the hall, her spine straight and her chin lifted despite the devastation building inside her chest, refusing to let him see the tears she felt gathering behind her eyes. She had promised herself, weeks earlier, that she would not spend her life waiting to be told she was not worth the risk. Tomorrow, it seemed, she would learn exactly how right she had been to fear that promise might one day be broken. The great hall of Ravenswood, filled to capacity by mid-morning, every pack leader of the Northern Territories seated in careful order of rank and status, their advisors and guards arranged behind them in a dense wall of watching eyes. Elena stood near the back of the chamber, flanked by her mother and sisters, her heart pounding so violently she was certain the wolves nearest to her could hear it. She had not slept. She had spent the entire night alternating between silent grief and a slowly hardening resolve, and by the time dawn broke over the eastern towers, she had made a private decision of her own. Whatever happened today, she would not collapse before this crowd the way she had once feared she might. She would stand exactly as tall as she had stood the night of the ceremony, regardless of what words were about to be spoken against her. Draven entered the chamber flanked by Edmund, General Callum, and a full contingent of his personal guard, his expression carved into the same unreadable mask he wore during matters of state, though Elena, watching from across the crowded hall, could see the tension radiating from every line of his body. He took his place upon the raised throne at the head of the chamber, and the assembled pack leaders rose briefly in formal acknowledgement before settling back into watchful silence. Alpha Garrick sat near the front of the gathering, his expression carefully composed into polite attentiveness, though Elena did not miss the faint, satisfied curve at the corner of his mouth, the look of a predator who believed his patient waiting was finally about to be rewarded. The gathering began with formal matters of trade and border security, discussions that stretched on for what felt to Elena like an agonizing eternity, each passing minute tightening the knot of dread in her stomach further. She listened without truly hearing, her attention fixed entirely on Draven, searching his carefully controlled expression for any sign of what was coming, though he never once let his gaze drift toward the back of the chamber where she stood. Finally, as the formal agenda drew toward its conclusion, Edmund rose from his position beside the throne and addressed the assembled pack leaders directly. "Before this gathering concludes," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber, "His Majesty wishes to address the matter that has occupied considerable attention throughout the Northern Territories in recent weeks." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd, and Elena felt her mother's hand close briefly around her wrist, whether in warning or in some rare gesture of comfort. Elena could not tell. Draven rose from his throne, and the entire chamber fell into absolute silence, every eye fixed upon him with rapt attention. Elena watched him scan the crowd, watched his gaze finally find her across the packed hall, and for one brief moment, something raw and pained flickered across his features before he forced his expression back into careful composure. "3 weeks ago," Draven began, his voice steady despite whatever turmoil Elena knew must be raging beneath the surface. "During the mating moon ceremony, an unprecedented bond formed between myself and Elena Voss, a wolf of the Voss family. I will not pretend that bond was anything other than genuine. The recognition ritual confirmed it beyond any possibility of doubt." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Elena felt every eye in the chamber shift briefly toward her before returning to the king. "However," Draven continued, and Elena felt her heart plummet at the shift in his tone, the careful pivot toward something colder and more formal. "As king of the sworn packs, my duty extends beyond personal matters to the safety and stability of every territory under my protection. Recent events have made clear that this bond, however genuine, has created significant vulnerability within our alliance, vulnerability that certain parties have already begun to exploit for their own political advantage." Elena felt the room begin to tilt around her, the careful composure she had promised herself she would maintain, beginning to crack under the weight of what she now understood was coming. After considerable deliberation, Draven said, his voice dropping into something that sounded almost mechanical, as though he were forcing the words out through sheer will alone, I have concluded that the stability of the sworn pacts must take precedence over personal considerations. Effective immediately, I formally reject the mate bond between myself and Elena Voss. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, and she felt her knees weaken beneath her, though she forced herself to remain standing through sheer stubborn will. The ancient magic of the rejection took hold almost instantly, a searing, wrenching sensation tearing through her chest, as though something vital were being ripped violently from her body. She gasped, unable to fully contain the sound of pain that escaped her, and felt her mother's grip on her wrist tighten, though whether to steady her, or simply to prevent a scene, Elena could not tell. Around her, the assembled pack leaders erupted into a storm of murmured reactions, some expressing sympathy, others nodding with grim approval at what they perceived as a demonstration of strength and decisive leadership. Elena barely registered any of it, consumed entirely by the devastating physical and emotional agony tearing through her body, a pain unlike anything she had ever experienced, as though the very core of her being had been violently severed. She looked up, through the haze of pain clouding her vision, and found Draven's eyes fixed on hers across the crowded chamber. For one unguarded moment, she saw the full depth of his anguish laid bare, the same devastation she felt reflected in his own expression, before he forced himself to look away, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Elena did not wait to hear whatever formal proceedings followed. She turned, pushing past her mother's restraining hand, and walked out of the great hall with as much dignity as her trembling body could muster, ignoring the whispered murmurs and pitying glances that followed her exit. She made it as far as the courtyard before her legs finally gave way entirely, and she collapsed against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath through the searing pain still radiating outward from her chest. She did not know how long she remained there, curled against the stone, before Clara found her, her sister's face etched with genuine alarm as she knelt beside Elena, gathering her into a fierce embrace that Elena was too devastated to resist. "I have you," Clara murmured. "I have you, Elena. Just breathe." Elena did not have the strength to respond, consumed entirely by the crushing weight of what had just happened, the devastating confirmation of every fear that had haunted her since the night the bond first formed. She had allowed herself to hope, despite everything, despite her mother's warnings and her own hard-won wariness, and that hope had been crushed as publicly and brutally as her mother's cruel words had been weeks earlier, except this rejection carried a devastation far beyond mere humiliation, a physical and emotional wound that felt as though it might never fully heal. Inside the great hall, the gathering continued its formal proceedings, Draven forcing himself to remain seated upon his throne despite the crushing weight settling over his own body, the beginning of the weakening the elders had warned him would follow such a rejection. He felt it immediately, a hollow ache spreading through his chest, as though some essential piece of himself had been forcibly torn away, and he understood, with sudden and devastating clarity, exactly what he had sacrificed in the name of political necessity. Garrick approached him following the gathering's conclusion, his expression carrying poorly disguised satisfaction beneath a veneer of diplomatic courtesy. "A wise decision, Your Majesty," Garrick said. "Decisive leadership, exactly what the Northern Territories need to see from their king." Draven said nothing, unable to summon even the energy required for careful diplomatic response, and Garrick eventually retreated, apparently satisfied with the reaction he had provoked, though he could not have known the true depth of the devastation hidden beneath Draven's carefully controlled exterior. Edmund found him alone in the council chamber hours later, staring out at the darkening courtyard below, his expression hollow in a way Edmund had never witnessed in 7 years of service. "You made the right decision," Edmund said quietly, though even his voice carried less conviction than it had during their earlier discussions. "Garrick's influence has already begun to weaken. 2 of the pack leaders who had begun quietly aligning with Thornwood approached me after the gathering, expressing renewed confidence in your leadership." "Did they?" Draven said flatly, the words carrying no genuine interest. Edmund studied him carefully, some flicker of concern crossing his weathered features. "Your Majesty, the weakening will pass. The elders assured us it is temporary. The weakening is not what troubles me, Draven said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express openly. I have felt many kinds of pain in my life, Edmund. I have lost comrades in battle. I watched my father die from poison, delivered by cowards who feared confronting him directly. None of it compares to what I felt today, watching her walk away from me, knowing that I was the one who caused that particular agony. Edmund had no response to offer, and the two men remained in silence for a long while, the weight of the day's events settling heavily over the entire chamber. Elsewhere in Ravenswood Hall, Elena remained in her chambers through the remainder of that devastating day, Clara refusing to leave her side despite Elena's repeated insistence that she needed no company. The physical pain of the rejection had begun to fade into a dull, persistent ache by evening, but the emotional devastation remained as sharp and merciless as it had been in the moment of Draven's formal declaration. I should never have believed it could last, Elena said quietly, staring at the ceiling of her room as evening shadows lengthened across the walls. I knew from the very beginning what political pressures existed. I told myself I was prepared for this outcome. I was not prepared for this. No one could have prepared for this, Clara said gently. What he did today, whatever justification he offers, was cruel, regardless of the political circumstances surrounding it. Elena closed her eyes, feeling exhaustion pulling at every part of her body, the physical toll of the rejection ritual compounding the emotional devastation until she could barely distinguish between the two. I need to leave this place, she said finally, the words surprising even herself as she spoke them aloud. I cannot remain here, surrounded by wolves who watch today's humiliation, surrounded by a mother who will undoubtedly remind me at every opportunity that she warned me exactly this would happen. Clara studied her sister carefully, something thoughtful crossing her expression. Where would you go? I do not know yet, Elena admitted, but I know I cannot stay in this hall, pretending to build a life among wolves, who have already decided my worth, based on a single devastating night. I need to discover, away from all of this, exactly what I am truly capable of becoming. Clara said nothing further that night, though Elena could see the concern still etched clearly across her sister's face. But something had shifted within Elena during those long, agonizing hours following the rejection, some quiet resolve solidifying beneath the raw devastation of her grief. She thought of Ulrich's words about her suppressed bloodline, of the faint but undeniable strength she had begun coaxing to the surface during her private training sessions in the weeks before the gathering. She would not remain here, broken and humiliated, waiting for anyone's pity or permission to rebuild her own worth. Whatever pain the rejection had caused, whatever devastating weight it had left behind, Elena understood, with a clarity that surprised her even through her grief, that she alone would decide what happened next. The following morning, before the sun had fully risen over Ravenswood Hall, Elena gathered what few belongings she could carry, left a brief note for Clara, explaining nothing of her intended destination, and slipped quietly out of the hall that had brought her nothing but pain and public humiliation for the entirety of her life. She did not know where her path would lead her, only that she could not remain in this place a moment longer, surrounded by the wreckage of a bond that had promised her everything and delivered instead the most devastating rejection imaginable. Behind her, Ravenswood Hall continued its slow return to normalcy, the visiting pack leaders departing over the following days, the political crisis Garrick had so carefully engineered, gradually subsiding into quiet, uneasy resolution. But within the walls of the royal wing, King Draven Ashford remained haunted by a devastation he could not fully explain to his advisors, a hollow ache that showed no signs of fading, despite Edmund's repeated assurances that the weakening would soon pass. He did not yet know that Elena had vanished from the hall entirely, that the woman he had rejected before an entire assembly of pack leaders had already begun a journey that would transform her into someone he would barely recognize when their paths inevitably crossed again. He only knew that something essential had been torn from his life in that great hall, and that no amount of political stability could fully compensate for the devastating cost of what he had sacrificed. Lady Mirren discovered her daughter's absence shortly after dawn, when Clara, unable to keep the secret any longer once she realized Elena had actually gone through with her intentions, finally confessed what she knew to their mother. Mirren's reaction surprised even Clara, who had expected either cold indifference or renewed criticism of Elena's dramatic departure. Instead, Mirren sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her face draining of color, and remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I did this," she said quietly, more to herself than to Clara. "Every cruel word I ever said to that girl, every public humiliation I heaped upon her, because I could not bear the shame of a daughter the pack considered weak. I made her believe she deserved nothing better than rejection, and now she has walked away from everything she has ever known, because I never gave her a single reason to believe she might belong here." Clara had never heard her mother speak with such raw honesty, and she found herself unable to offer any comforting response, uncertain whether comfort was even warranted given the truth in her mother's words. "Should we search for her?" Clara asked finally. Mirren was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of regret and something that looked almost like resignation. "No," she said finally. "I do not think searching for her would accomplish anything beneficial. Not now. She needs to discover, away from this family, away from everything that has shaped her these past 6 years, exactly who she is capable of becoming. Perhaps, when she is ready, she will choose to return, but that choice must belong entirely to her." It was, Clara realized, perhaps the single wisest thing her mother had said in years, though the wisdom had come at a devastating cost that none of them could undo. Word of Elena's disappearance spread through Ravenswood Hall within days, whispered alongside the already circulating stories of her public rejection, and the combination of scandal and mystery ensured that her name remained a frequent topic of hushed conversation throughout the pack for weeks afterward. Some wolves expressed genuine sympathy for her plight, moved by the cruelty of a public rejection following so closely on the heels of her mother's earlier humiliation. Others, particularly those who had never much liked the Voss family's youngest daughter, whispered that her disappearance only confirmed what everyone had always suspected, that she had never truly been capable of surviving the pressures of pack life at the highest levels. Draven heard the rumors of her disappearance through Edmund, delivered with careful neutrality during one of their regular council meetings, and felt something cold and desperate seize hold of his chest at the news. He had told himself, in the days following the rejection, that Elena would remain within Ravenswood Hall, that despite everything, she would rebuild some kind of life within the only community she had ever known. The knowledge that she had vanished entirely, with no indication of her intended destination, filled him with a fear he had not anticipated experiencing. "Has anyone attempted to locate her?" Draven asked, his voice carrying more urgency than he intended. "Lady Mirren has apparently decided against pursuing her daughter," Edmund replied carefully. "Given the circumstances, Your Majesty, I would advise against sending your own search parties. It would raise significant questions about your motivations, given the formal rejection you performed before the entire assembly of pack leaders." Draven understood the political wisdom of Edmund's caution, even as every instinct in his body screamed against accepting it. He had spent 7 years mastering the art of subordinating personal desire to political necessity, and yet the crushing weight of that mastery had never felt as hollow and unbearable as it did now. Weeks after the rejection, as the physical weakening the elders had promised would fade, instead seemed to deepen with each passing day. He found himself increasingly unable to concentrate during council meetings, his thoughts drifting constantly toward memories of their conversations beneath the old oak tree, the honesty in her voice, the quiet strength she had displayed even in the face of overwhelming cruelty from every direction. He began sleeping even less than he had before the ceremony, plagued by dreams he could not fully remember upon waking, though he always woke with a lingering sense of grief that took hours to fully shake off. Alric noticed the change in the king most acutely, having spent decades observing wolves suffering through various forms of loss and trauma, and approached Draven privately several weeks after the gathering, his expression carrying the particular gravity of an old wolf who had seen enough history to recognize a pattern repeating itself. "Your Majesty," Alric said, finding Draven alone in the council chamber late one evening, "I fear I did not adequately convey the true severity of my earlier warnings regarding the strength of your bond with Elena Voss." Draven looked up, his expression carrying the hollow exhaustion that had become his near-constant companion since the rejection. "What are you telling me, Alric?" "I am telling you," Alric said carefully, "that the weakening you continue to experience, weeks after a rejection that should have long since stabilized, suggests that the bond between you and Elena was significantly stronger than even I initially recognized. The old texts speak of certain rare bonds, ones formed between wolves whose fates are so thoroughly intertwined that rejection does not simply cause temporary weakening, but instead creates a wound that continues to deepen the longer the separation persists. Draven felt something cold settle over him at Alric's words, a dawning understanding of just how catastrophically he might have miscalculated the consequences of his decision. Are you telling me this weakening will not pass on its own? I am telling you, Alric said gently, that I do not know for certain, Your Majesty, because bonds of this particular strength are exceedingly rare in recorded history. But I would be doing you a disservice if I did not share my genuine concern that the path you have chosen may cost you far more than the political stability you sought to protect. The words settled over Draven like a physical weight, confirming fears he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge, even to himself in the weeks since the rejection. He thought of Elena's face in that final moment, before she turned and walked away from him in the great hall, the raw devastation he had glimpsed, before she forced her own expression into careful composure. He thought of his own promise to her, weeks earlier beneath the old oak tree, that bonding with her had not been a mistake, regardless of what followed. He had broken that promise in the most public and devastating way possible, and now, weeks later, he was beginning to understand that the cost of that decision might extend far beyond his own physical weakening, might threaten the very stability of his reign that he had sacrificed everything to protect. "What would you have me do, Alric?" Draven asked, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine uncertainty. "I cannot tell you what to do, Your Majesty," Alric said honestly. "That decision belongs entirely to you. But I would advise you to consider carefully what kind of king you wish to become, and whether the strength you sought to demonstrate through rejection has truly served the purpose you intended, or whether it has instead planted the seeds of a far greater vulnerability than the one you sought to eliminate." Alric left him alone with those words, and Draven remained in the empty council chamber long into the night, wrestling with the growing certainty that his decision, made under the crushing weight of political pressure and inherited fear, might prove to be the single greatest mistake of his entire reign. He did not yet know where Elena had gone, did not know whether she would ever be willing to forgive him, even if their paths somehow crossed again. He only knew that the hollow ache in his chest showed no signs of fading, that his kingdom's stability, which he had sacrificed everything to protect, now felt more fragile than ever before, threatened not by external enemies like Garrick, but by the devastating internal cost of a decision he could not undo. Far beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall, unaware of the growing crisis her rejection had created within the king who had cast her aside, Elena Voss continued her solitary journey through unfamiliar territory, carrying with her nothing but a small satchel of belongings, a heart still raw with devastating grief, and a quiet, growing determination to discover exactly what she was truly capable of becoming, far from the judgment and cruelty that had defined every day of her life until now. She did not know that her path would soon lead her to wolves who would see her potential far more clearly than anyone at Ravenswood Hall ever had. She only knew that she could not go back, that whatever waited for her in the unknown territories ahead had to be better than the devastating humiliation she had left behind. The growl came from the shadows before Elena even saw the wolf attached to it, low and threatening, freezing her mid-step on the narrow forest path she had been following for 3 days straight. She had crossed into unfamiliar territory sometime during the previous night, territory that belonged to no pack she recognized from her studies at Ravenswood Hall, and the sudden realization that she had wandered into dangerous, unclaimed land settled over her with a jolt of genuine fear. A massive gray wolf emerged from the tree line, teeth bared, muscles coiled with the readiness to strike, and Elena felt every instinct in her body scream at her to run. But 3 weeks of solitary travel, 3 weeks of surviving on nothing but her own wits, and the fragile new strength she had been cultivating since her rejection, had taught her something valuable about the difference between fear and helplessness. She stood her ground, drawing on the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the devastating humiliation of that final gathering in the Great Hall, and allowed her own wolf to rise closer to the surface than she had ever dared before her exile began. I mean no harm, Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. I am simply passing through. The gray wolf did not retreat, but neither did it advance further, studying her with an intelligence that suggested this was no ordinary feral beast, but rather a shifter fully in control of its faculties, sizing up a potential threat with careful calculation. No one passes through this territory without an escort, came a voice from somewhere behind the wolf, and a moment later, a woman stepped out from the shadows of the trees, her expression carrying the same wary assessment as the wolf beside her. She was tall and weathered, her dark hair streaked with gray despite what Elena guessed was a relatively young age, and she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. I apologize for the intrusion, Elena said carefully. I did not realize this territory belonged to anyone. I have been traveling for several weeks without a clear destination. The woman studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Elena's disheveled appearance, the exhaustion clearly visible despite Elena's efforts to maintain some semblance of composure. You are running from something, the woman said. It was not a question. Elena considered denying it, some old instinct urging her toward the careful self-protection she had learned during years of navigating her mother's cruelty, but something about the woman's direct, unflinching gaze made deception feel pointless. I am, she admitted. Most wolves who wander into this territory are, the woman said, something almost like understanding, softening her weathered features. I am Freya. This territory belongs to the Ashgrove Pack, a gathering of wolves who found no place for themselves among the formal territories of the sworn packs. We do not typically welcome strangers, but we also do not typically leave lone travelers stranded in unfamiliar forest without at least offering shelter for the night. Elena hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this unexpected offer of hospitality after weeks of careful solitary survival, but exhaustion and hunger ultimately won out over caution. I would be grateful for shelter, she said finally. Freya led her deeper into the forest, the gray wolf trailing behind them with watchful attention until they reached a hidden settlement Elena would never have discovered on her own, a collection of sturdy wooden structures built cleverly among the trees, home to what appeared to be several dozen wolves going about the quiet business of daily life. Elena felt the weight of numerous curious stares as Freya led her through the settlement, though none carried the open hostility or judgment she had grown accustomed to enduring at Ravenswood Hall. Who are these wolves? Elena asked, genuinely curious despite her exhaustion. Outcasts, Freya said simply. Rejected mates. Wolves whose bloodlines were deemed unworthy by the formal packs. Shifters who never fit neatly into the rigid hierarchies the sworn packs demand. We have built something different here, away from the judgment and cruelty that defines most pack territories. Something in Elena's chest loosened at those words, a recognition of shared experience she had not expected to find so soon after her own devastating rejection. How long has this settlement existed? Nearly 3 decades, Freya said. I founded it myself, after my own mate rejected me for political reasons, remarkably similar, I suspect, to whatever brought you wandering into our territory. Elena stopped walking, staring at Freya with genuine surprise. You were rejected? By an alpha who believed my bloodline too weak to strengthen his political position, Freya said, her voice carrying no visible bitterness, despite the clear weight of the memory. It took me years to rebuild myself after that rejection, to understand that my worth was never truly determined by his judgment of me. Eventually, I found others who had suffered similar fates, and together we built something the formal packs never offered any of us, a place where strength is measured by resilience and character, rather than bloodline and political convenience. Over the following days, as Elena settled tentatively into the rhythms of the Ashgrove settlement, she found herself drawn increasingly to Freya's quiet wisdom, spending long hours learning the history of the pack's formation, meeting other wolves who carried their own stories of rejection and exile, discovering slowly that her own devastating experience, while uniquely painful, was far from unique in its fundamental shape. She met Owen, a broad-shouldered young wolf, whose family had disowned him after his wolf failed to manifest until well past the usual age, forcing him to endure years of humiliation before finally finding acceptance among the Ashgrove pack. She met Lila, an older woman whose mate had died in battle, leaving her without status or protection within her original territory, cast out by pack leaders who saw no further use for a widow without political value. Each story carried its own particular cruelty, and yet each wolf Elena met had found, within the walls of this hidden settlement, a strength and dignity that the formal packs had denied them. "You carry yourself differently than when you first arrived," Freya observed one evening, several weeks into Elena's stay, as they sat together near the settlement's central fire, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. "I feel differently," Elena admitted. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I do not feel as though my worth is being constantly measured and found wanting." Freya nodded, studying her with careful consideration. "There is something in you, Elena, some strength I do not think you have yet fully recognized. Your wolf has been growing stronger since you arrived, more confident with each shift. I have watched enough suppressed wolves reclaim their true strength over the years to recognize the pattern developing in you." It was true, though Elena had barely allowed herself to fully acknowledge the transformation taking place within her own body over the past several weeks. Free from the constant weight of judgment that had defined her entire existence at Ravenswood Hall, her wolf had begun emerging with a strength and confidence she had never before experienced, each shift coming more easily than the last, each training session revealing capabilities that 6 years of desperate effort under her mother's critical eye had never once managed to unlock. "Alric, an elder from my former pack, believed my father carried an ancient bloodline," Elena said, sharing the theory for the first time with someone outside her immediate family. "He believed my weakness was never genuine, but rather a suppression caused by years of trauma and rejection." Freya's expression shifted into something more intent, genuine interest sharpening her gaze. "What was your father's family name?" "Voss. Though he rarely spoke of his origins, he came from a minor territory to the far north." Freya was quiet for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her eyes. "There are old stories," she said finally, "of a bloodline that once carried significant power among the northern wolves, a line believed extinct for generations, following a great conflict that scattered its surviving members across the territories, forcing many to hide their true heritage to avoid persecution from rival packs who feared their strength." Elena felt a chill move through her at Freya's words, the pieces of her own scattered family history beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern she had never before considered. "You believe my father might have descended from this bloodline?" "I believe it is possible," Freya said carefully. "And if true, it would explain a great deal about the strength of your bond with the king you mentioned, and about the remarkable progress your wolf has made in such a short period of time, once finally freed from the suppression that had held it back for so many years." Over the following weeks, Freya began training Elena with a level of dedication and expertise Elena had never before encountered, drawing on decades of knowledge about ancient bloodlines and suppressed strength that the formal packs, obsessed with rigid hierarchies and immediate visible power, had largely forgotten or dismissed entirely. Elena threw herself into the training with a fierce determination, pushing her body and her wolf further with each passing day, discovering capabilities that continued to surprise even Freya, whose decades of experience training rejected and suppressed wolves had given her a keen eye for genuine potential. By the time 3 months had passed since her arrival at the Ashgrove settlement, Elena had transformed in ways that went far beyond the physical strength of her wolf. She had rebuilt, piece by careful piece, a sense of self-worth that 6 years of her mother's cruelty and one devastating public rejection had nearly destroyed entirely. She moved through the settlement now with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself, a far cry from the anxious, self-doubting young woman who had stumbled into Ashgrove territory weeks earlier, fleeing the wreckage of a broken bond and a lifetime of accumulated humiliation. She thought of Draven often during those months, unable to fully suppress the memory of his amber eyes, or the honest vulnerability he had shown her during their brief conversations beneath the old oak tree. The wound of his rejection had not fully healed, and she suspected some part of it never would, but she found that the raw devastation of those early weeks had gradually settled into something quieter, something she could carry without it consuming her entirely. She did not know that far beyond the borders of the Ashgrove territory, The king who had rejected her was suffering through a devastating decline of his own, his kingdom's stability beginning to fracture under the weight of a weakening that showed no signs of the temporary recovery his advisors had once promised him. She did not know that the political calm Garrick's manipulations had temporarily disrupted was already beginning to unravel again, this time driven not by external threat, but by the internal collapse of a king who had sacrificed his own heart in the name of duty, only to discover that duty alone could not sustain a kingdom whose ruler no longer possessed the strength to lead it. For now, Elena remained focused entirely on her own transformation, unaware of the growing crisis unfolding within the walls of Ravenswood Hall, training beneath Freya's careful guidance, with a dedication born from equal parts grief and determination, slowly but unmistakably becoming the wolf she had always been capable of becoming, if only someone had given her the chance to discover it long before a cruel mother and a fearful king had nearly convinced her otherwise. The true test of Elena's transformation came nearly 4 months after her arrival at Ashgrove, when a small band of rogue wolves, driven from their own territory by a particularly ruthless pack leader, attempted to raid the settlement's food stores during the harshest weeks of winter. Elena had been on watch duty that night, a responsibility Freya had begun entrusting to her only recently, and she was the first to notice the unfamiliar scent carried on the cold wind, sharp and unmistakable against the familiar smells of the settlement she now called home. She raised the alarm quickly, but not before the raiders had already breached the outer perimeter. 3 desperate wolves, driven by hunger and fear, into an act of aggression against a settlement that had done them no harm. Elena found herself facing the largest of the 3 alone, separated from the rest of the settlement's defenders by the chaos of the sudden confrontation. And in that moment, faced with genuine danger for the first time since her arrival, she discovered exactly how far her training had brought her. Her wolf answered her call without hesitation, the shift coming faster and more completely than she had ever experienced before, and she met the raiding wolf's aggressive charge with a confidence and strength that surprised even herself, holding her ground against an opponent considerably larger than she was, until Owen and 2 other settlement defenders arrived to help drive the raiders back into the surrounding forest. When the chaos finally settled, Freya found Elena standing near the settlement's perimeter, breathing hard but very much unharmed, and something like genuine pride crossed the older woman's weathered features. "You held your ground," Freya said, studying Elena with renewed appreciation. "Against a wolf nearly twice your size. With training you have only begun developing these past 4 months. That is not the strength of a weak bloodline, Elena. That is the strength of a wolf finally allowed to become what she was always meant to be." Elena felt something settle firmly into place within her chest at Freya's words, a confirmation of the transformation she had been quietly cultivating since her arrival, and for the first time since the devastating rejection that had driven her from Ravenswood Hall, she felt something close to genuine pride in her own capabilities, unclouded by the anxious self-doubt that had haunted nearly every accomplishment of her life before now. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the small settlement, and Elena found herself regarded with a new level of respect among the Ashgrove wolves, no longer simply the grieving stranger who had wandered into their territory months earlier, but a genuine and valued member of their community, someone whose strength and dedication had proven itself in a moment of real danger. That respect deepened further over the following weeks, as Elena began taking on greater responsibilities within the settlement, helping train younger wolves who had arrived with their own stories of rejection and trauma, sharing the hard-won lessons of her own transformation, with others still struggling to believe in their own worth after years of cruelty from families and packs who had failed them. "You have a gift for this," Freya observed one afternoon, watching Elena patiently work with a young wolf named Petra, whose own family had rejected her years earlier for a physical disability that made full shifting difficult and painful. "You understand, in a way many trainers never fully grasp, that strength cannot be forced from the outside. It must be coaxed gently from within, built on a foundation of genuine belief rather than fear or pressure." Elena considered Freya's words carefully, recognizing the truth in them, even as she recognized how far she herself had traveled from the anxious young woman who had once pushed herself to exhaustion in a desperate attempt to prove her mother wrong. "I understand what it feels like to be told your weakness is permanent and unchangeable," Elena said. I do not wish anyone else to carry that same false belief longer than necessary. As the months continued to pass, Elena's reputation within the settlement grew steadily, and with it, her own sense of identity and purpose solidified into something she had never before believed possible for herself. She was no longer simply Elena Voss, the daughter her mother had publicly humiliated. The wolf, the most powerful king in the Northern Territories, had rejected before an entire assembly of pack leaders. She had become someone new, someone whose worth was measured not by bloodline or political convenience, but by genuine character, resilience, and the quiet strength she had rebuilt from the wreckage of devastating rejection. But even as her new life at Ashgrove continued to flourish, Elena could not entirely escape the lingering shadow of what she had left behind at Ravenswood Hall. Occasionally, traveling merchants passing near the settlement's borders would carry fragments of news from the formal pack territories, and Elena found herself listening with a complicated mixture of curiosity and reluctant concern whenever conversations turned toward the political situation within the sworn packs. The news that reached Ashgrove painted a troubling picture of a kingdom in growing turmoil. King Draven Ashford, once regarded as the most formidable and unshakable ruler in the Northern Territories, had apparently grown increasingly withdrawn and ineffective in the months following his formal rejection of his fated mate. Rumors spoke of a physical decline that showed no signs of the temporary recovery his advisors had once promised, of a king who moved through his duties with visible exhaustion and diminished authority, of growing whispers among the pack leaders that perhaps Alpha Garrick's earlier warnings about weakness and vulnerability had proven more accurate than anyone initially believed. Elena found herself troubled by these fragments of news in ways she had not expected, an unwelcome tangle of emotions she had believed largely resolved during her months of dedicated training and rebuilding. Some part of her, the part still nursing the raw wound of his devastating public rejection, felt a grim satisfaction at the reports of his growing weakness, a bitter sense that he was finally reaping the consequences of the cruelty he had inflicted upon her. But another part of her, one she found harder to fully suppress despite everything, felt genuine concern for a man who had shown her, in their brief private conversations, a vulnerability and honesty she had rarely encountered from anyone else in her entire life. "You are troubled," Freya observed one evening, finding Elena sitting alone near the settlement's central fire, her expression distant and conflicted. "I heard news of the king today," Elena admitted. "Reports of his continued decline since our bond was severed. I do not know how to feel about it." Freya settled beside her, studying the flickering flames with careful consideration. "Grief and anger rarely resolve themselves in neat, uncomplicated ways," she said gently. "It is entirely possible to feel genuine anger at what he did to you and genuine concern for his well-being simultaneously. Neither feeling negates the validity of the other." Elena appreciated Freya's wisdom, though it did little to fully untangle the complicated knot of emotions still lodged firmly in her chest whenever thoughts of Draven surfaced, which happened more frequently than she cared to admit even to herself. Alric warned him, apparently, that our bond was unusually strong. "Freya, do you believe it is possible that rejection alone cannot fully sever a bond as powerful as the one described to me?" Freya was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "The old texts speak of certain rare bonds that resist even formal rejection, wounds that continue to fester in both parties, until some form of genuine resolution is finally reached. If your bond was indeed as powerful as you have described, it is entirely possible that his continued decline reflects exactly that kind of unresolved wound." The implication settled heavily over Elena, stirring a complicated mixture of vindication and reluctant sympathy that she did not entirely know how to process. She had spent months rebuilding her own strength and identity, deliberately setting aside the devastating pain of Draven's rejection in favor of forward momentum and genuine healing. The possibility that their bond remained unresolved, that her own continued existence and growing strength might somehow be connected to his ongoing decline, raised questions she was not yet certain she wanted to fully confront. "What would you have me do?" Elena asked finally. "I would have you do nothing you are not genuinely ready to do," Freya said firmly. "You owe him nothing, Elena, regardless of what continues to unfold within his own kingdom as a consequence of his decision. You have spent months rebuilding a life for yourself, free from the cruelty and rejection that nearly destroyed you. Do not allow guilt or misplaced obligation to undo the genuine progress you have made, not unless you are certain, in your own heart, that any further involvement with him serves your own well-being rather than simply repeating old patterns of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. Freya's words lingered with Elena long into that night, and in the weeks that followed, she found herself returning to them repeatedly, weighing the complicated tangle of grief, anger, sympathy, and reluctant longing that thoughts of Draven continued to stir within her, even as her own strength and confidence continued their steady, transformative growth within the walls of the settlement that had become her true home. She did not yet know that fate, having already demonstrated its willingness to intervene so dramatically in her life once before, was preparing to force a confrontation neither she nor Draven could indefinitely avoid, a reckoning that would test everything she had rebuilt within herself against the devastating weight of unfinished business left behind at Ravenswood Hall. Draven collapsed in the middle of the council chamber on a cold morning nearly 6 months after the rejection, his legs simply giving out beneath him as he rose to address his assembled advisors, the sudden weakness striking without warning and leaving him crumpled against the stone floor, while Edmund and General Callum rushed to his side in alarm. "Summon the healers," Edmund shouted, kneeling beside the king, his usual composed authority cracking beneath genuine fear. Immediately. Draven regained partial consciousness within minutes, though the crushing exhaustion pressing down on every part of his body made even the simple act of speaking feel like an overwhelming effort. "I am fine," he managed, though the words carried little conviction even to his own ears. "You are not fine," General Callum said grimly, helping lift the king toward a nearby chair with the careful strength of a man who had carried wounded comrades from countless battlefields. "Your Majesty, this is the third collapse in as many weeks. Whatever this weakening is, it is not improving. It is worsening." The healers arrived shortly afterward, conducting a thorough examination that yielded little beyond confirmation of what everyone in the chamber had already begun to suspect. Draven's physical condition showed no signs of ordinary illness or injury, no infection or ailment that could be treated through conventional means. His body simply seemed to be failing, slowly and inexorably, in a manner the healers could not fully explain through their usual medical knowledge. "I believe," said the eldest healer present, an ancient wolf named Bertram, who had served the royal family for longer than anyone could clearly remember, "that this affliction lies beyond the scope of ordinary medicine. Your Majesty, this has the markings of a bond wound, a condition I have only encountered twice in my many years of practice, and both instances involved rejections of unusually powerful mate bonds." Draven closed his eyes, the confirmation of Alric's earlier warning settling over him with crushing finality. He had known, in the months since his devastating decision, that his continued decline suggested exactly this possibility, but hearing it, confirmed so definitively by the healer's careful examination, stripped away any remaining illusion that time alone might eventually resolve the wound he had inflicted upon himself. "Is there a cure?" Draven asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bertram's expression carried genuine sorrow as he delivered his answer. "The old texts suggest only one reliable remedy for a bond wound of this severity, Your Majesty. Genuine reconciliation with the rejected mate, a reversal of the rejection performed with full sincerity and mutual willingness. Without such reconciliation, I fear the wound will continue to deepen, potentially beyond the point of eventual recovery, regardless of how much time passes." The chamber fell into stunned silence at Bertram's grave pronouncement, and Draven felt the full weight of his devastating miscalculation finally crash down upon him with undeniable clarity. He had sacrificed his bond with Elena in the name of protecting his kingdom's stability, believing the political cost of vulnerability outweighed the personal cost of rejection. Instead, he had created a far greater vulnerability than the one he had sought to eliminate, a slow and potentially fatal decline that now threatened not only his own life, but the stability of the entire kingdom he had sacrificed so much to protect. "We must find her," Draven said, forcing himself upright despite the exhaustion still pulling at every part of his body. "Regardless of the political consequences, regardless of what Garrick or any other pack leader might make of it, I cannot continue leading this kingdom while dying from a wound of my own making." Edmund exchanged a troubled glance with General Callum, the weight of months of careful political calculation suddenly feeling insignificant against the stark reality of their king's declining health. "Your Majesty," Edmund said carefully, "we have had no confirmed sighting of Elena Voss since her departure from Ravenswood Hall 6 months ago. Lady Mirren refused to search for her daughter, believing she needed space to rebuild her own life. Finding her now, particularly if she has traveled far beyond our territories, may prove exceedingly difficult." "Then we begin searching immediately," Draven said, his voice carrying a renewed determination that cut through the exhaustion weighing down every word. "I do not care how difficult the search proves to be, Edmund. I made a devastating mistake 6 months ago, believing I was protecting this kingdom by sacrificing something I did not yet fully understand the value of. I will not compound that mistake further by simply accepting my own decline without at least attempting to make amends." Edmund studied his king for a long moment, seeing something in Draven's expression that had been notably absent during the difficult weeks leading up to the rejection, a clarity of purpose that seemed to cut through the careful political calculations that had once governed nearly every decision of his reign. "I will organize search parties immediately," Edmund said finally, "though I would caution you, Your Majesty, that even if we successfully locate her, there is no guarantee she will be willing to consider reconciliation after everything you put her through." "I am aware of that risk," Draven said quietly, "but I would rather face her refusal honestly than continue living a lie, pretending that political stability alone can sustain a kingdom whose ruler no longer possesses the strength or the will to properly lead it." Over the following weeks, as search parties fanned out across the northern territories seeking any trace of Elena's whereabouts, Draven continued his slow, steady decline, though the renewed sense of purpose sparked by his decision to seek reconciliation seemed to slow the progression somewhat, granting him enough strength to maintain at least the basic functions of his role as king. He threw himself into whatever remained of his official duties with a grim determination, refusing to allow his declining health to fully derail the stability of the kingdom, even as every passing day without news of Elena's location weighed more heavily upon him. Garrick, predictably, seized upon rumors of the king's declining health with renewed enthusiasm, once again calling for gatherings of pack leaders to discuss what he characterized as growing instability within the northern territories. Draven found himself forced to attend these gatherings despite his weakened condition, drawing on reserves of strength he did not fully know he still possessed, to project an image of continued authority and control, even as his body continued its slow betrayal beneath the careful facade. It was during one such gathering, nearly 2 months into the search for Elena, that a young messenger arrived at Ravenswood Hall, carrying news that finally offered Draven the first genuine hope he had experienced since his collapse in the council chamber weeks earlier. "Your Majesty," the messenger said, breathless from hard travel, "reports from the eastern trade routes speak of a settlement hidden within unclaimed forest territory, populated by wolves rejected from the formal packs. Merchants who have traded with this settlement describe a young woman among their ranks who matches the description of Elena Voss, a woman who has apparently earned significant respect within the settlement for her strength and dedication in training other rejected wolves." Draven felt something shift powerfully within his chest at the news, a surge of hope so intense it momentarily overwhelmed the constant exhaustion that had become his near-permanent companion in the months since his collapse. "Where is this settlement located?" "Several days' travel to the east, Your Majesty, within territory that belongs to no formal pack. The merchants call it Ash Grove." Edmund, present for the messenger's report, studied Draven with careful concern. "Your Majesty, your condition remains significantly weakened. A journey of several days through unclaimed territory carries considerable risk, particularly given your current physical state." "I understand the risk," Draven said, already rising from his seat despite the effort it clearly cost him. "But I have spent 6 months allowing fear and political calculation to dictate the most important decisions of my life. I will not allow further fear to prevent me from finally attempting to correct the single greatest mistake I have ever made." Edmund studied his king for a long moment, recognizing the same immovable resolve that had carried Draven through 7 difficult years of rule, tempered now by a hard-won humility that had been notably absent during the weeks leading up to the rejection. "I will accompany you," Edmund said finally, "and General Callum will provide adequate protection for the journey, given your weakened condition." The preparations for the journey moved quickly, and within 2 days, Draven found himself traveling east through unfamiliar forest territory, accompanied by a small contingent of trusted guards and advisors, his body weakened, but his resolve stronger than it had been in months. He thought, during the long hours of difficult travel, of everything he had learned since his devastating decision 6 months earlier, of Alric's warnings about the strength of their bond, of Bertram's grave pronouncement about the necessity of genuine reconciliation, of his own crushing regret at having sacrificed something he had not yet fully understood the value of until it was too late to easily reclaim. He did not know what he would find when he finally reached the settlement the messenger had described. He did not know whether Elena would even be willing to see him, let alone consider any possibility of reconciliation after the devastating public humiliation he had subjected her to before an entire assembly of pack leaders. He only knew that he could not continue living with the crushing weight of his regret without at least attempting to make things right, regardless of what she ultimately decided in response. As the small traveling party finally crossed into the unclaimed territory the messenger had described, Draven felt a complicated mixture of hope and dread settling over him in equal measure, uncertain whether the coming days would bring the reconciliation he desperately needed, or a final, devastating confirmation that some mistakes, once made, could never truly be undone. He did not yet know that the woman he was searching for had transformed dramatically during their 6 months apart, that the fragile, uncertain young woman he had rejected before an entire assembly of pack leaders had become someone considerably stronger, considerably more self-assured, and considerably less willing to simply accept whatever apology he might offer without first demanding a genuine reckoning for everything he had put her through. The Ashgrove settlement's outer perimeter guards intercepted Draven's small traveling party less than an hour after they crossed into the unclaimed territory. 3 wolves emerging from the dense forest cover, with the same wary readiness Elena had encountered months earlier during her own arrival, though this time accompanied by considerably more caution given the size and evident authority of the approaching group. "This territory does not welcome uninvited visitors," said the lead guard, a broad-shouldered man Elena would have recognized as Owen, his stance carrying clear warning, despite being significantly outnumbered by the king's guard. "We seek only peaceful audience," Edmund said carefully, stepping forward before Draven could speak, mindful of the king's weakened condition and the potential volatility of an unfamiliar territory's defenders. "We have traveled a considerable distance, seeking a woman we believe resides within your settlement. We mean no harm to anyone here." Owen studied the group carefully, his gaze eventually settling on Draven himself, taking in the visible signs of exhaustion and weakness that even careful posture could not fully disguise. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that suggested he had perhaps heard descriptions of the king from Elena herself during the months of her residence within the settlement. "Wait here," Owen said finally, his tone carrying less hostility than before, though no less caution. "I will inform our leader of your presence. She will determine whether your audience is warranted." The traveling party waited in tense silence for nearly an hour before Owen returned, accompanied this time by Freya herself, whose sharp, assessing gaze swept over the assembled group with the same careful calculation she had once directed toward Elena during her own unexpected arrival months earlier. "King Draven Ashford," Freya said, her tone carrying deliberate formality that nonetheless failed to fully disguise an underlying edge of challenge. "I confess I did not expect to receive royal visitors within our humble territory." "You know who I am," Draven said, some of his usual authority returning to his voice despite his weakened condition. "I know exactly who you are," Freya said, her expression hardening slightly. "And I know precisely what you did to a young woman who arrived at our settlement 6 months ago, broken and devastated by a public rejection performed before an entire assembly of pack leaders. Forgive me if my welcome carries less warmth than you might be accustomed to receiving, Your Majesty." Draven absorbed the rebuke without flinching, recognizing the justice in Freya's evident anger. "I understand your reluctance to welcome me warmly," he said quietly. "I have come seeking Elena, not to demand anything of her, but simply to offer the genuine apology and explanation I failed to provide before making the most devastating mistake of my entire life." Freya studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her sharp eyes as she weighed his evident sincerity against her own protective instincts toward a young woman who had become genuinely important to the community she had spent decades building. Elena has rebuilt herself considerably during her time here, Freya said finally. She is no longer the fragile, uncertain woman who first arrived at our settlement, devastated and searching for any place that might offer her genuine belonging. Whatever you hope to accomplish through this visit, Your Majesty, understand that she owes you nothing, regardless of the political or magical consequences you may currently be suffering. I am aware of that, Draven said. I do not come seeking to demand reconciliation, only to offer the honesty and explanation I failed to provide before, and to allow her the opportunity to decide for herself what, if anything, she wishes to do with that honesty. Freya remained silent for a long moment, studying the king with an expression that gradually shifted from guarded hostility toward something more contemplative. I will inform her of your presence, she said finally. But I will not force this meeting upon her, Your Majesty. If she chooses not to see you, I would strongly advise you to respect that choice and return to your own territory without further attempt at contact. I understand, Draven said, though the words cost him considerable effort, given the desperate hope still burning within his weakened chest. Freya left them waiting once again, at the edge of the settlement's perimeter, and the minutes that followed felt to Draven like some of the longest of his entire life, each passing moment carrying the crushing possibility that Elena might simply refuse to see him at all, that his journey across difficult territory in his weakened condition might ultimately prove entirely futile. Inside the settlement, Freya found Elena in the midst of training a group of younger wolves in the techniques of controlled shifting, her movements carrying the confident authority of someone who had fully embraced her own hard-won strength. Freya watched for a moment before approaching, admiring once again the remarkable transformation that had taken place within the young woman since her arrival months earlier. Elena, Freya said, waiting until the training session reached a natural pause. We have visitors at the settlement's perimeter. King Draven Ashford has traveled here seeking audience with you. Elena felt the world seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet at Freya's words, months of carefully rebuilt composure suddenly tested by the unexpected news. He is here? She managed finally, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of shock and something she could not immediately identify. He is, Freya confirmed. He appears genuinely weakened, Elena, physically diminished in a manner that suggests significant illness or affliction. He claims to seek only the opportunity to offer explanation and apology, though I made clear to him that the choice of whether to grant that audience belongs entirely to you. Elena stood in silence for a long moment, her mind racing through the complicated tangle of emotions that Freya's news had immediately stirred within her, months of carefully cultivated peace suddenly disrupted by the reality of Draven's unexpected arrival. She thought of the devastating pain of his public rejection, of the months of difficult healing that had followed, of the strength and identity she had rebuilt for herself, far from the judgment and cruelty that had defined her entire existence at Ravenswood Hall. She thought, too, of the complicated concern she had felt upon hearing news of his declining health, of Freya's earlier suggestion that their bond might remain unresolved despite the formal rejection he had performed before an entire assembly of pack leaders. I need a moment, Elena said finally. Freya nodded, understanding immediately, and stepped back to allow Elena the space to process this unexpected turn of events, without additional pressure. Elena walked slowly toward the edge of the training grounds, staring out at the familiar forest that had become her home over the past 6 months, searching within herself for clarity amid the sudden storm of conflicting emotions. She thought of the young woman who had first arrived at this settlement, broken and devastated, uncertain whether she would ever recover from the crushing weight of Draven's public rejection. That young woman felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone considerably stronger, considerably more self-assured, someone who had learned to measure her own worth through genuine achievement and character, rather than the approval or rejection of others. But even as she recognized how far she had traveled from that earlier version of herself, Elena could not fully deny the complicated pull of curiosity, and something harder to name, that Draven's unexpected arrival had stirred within her. She had spent months deliberately setting aside thoughts of him in favor of forward momentum and genuine healing, and yet some part of her, she now recognized, had never fully resolved the questions left hanging in the aftermath of that devastating rejection. She thought of his final words to her beneath the old oak tree, his admission that he did not know how to protect both his kingdom and what had grown between them. She thought of the raw anguish she had glimpsed in his expression during that final devastating moment in the great hall, before he had forced himself to look away from her, unable to hold her gaze any longer. Whatever pain he had caused her, whatever devastating consequences his decision had inflicted upon her life, Elena found herself recognizing, standing alone at the edge of the training grounds, that she was no longer the same woman who had fled Ravenswood Hall in devastated silence 6 months earlier. She had rebuilt herself into someone strong enough to face this confrontation directly, someone capable of demanding the genuine reckoning she deserved, rather than simply accepting whatever apology he might offer without question. She turned back toward Freya, her expression settling into something calm and resolute, despite the complicated storm of emotions still churning beneath the surface. "I will see him," Elena said finally, "but on my own terms, Freya. Whatever happens, I will not be the same woman he rejected 6 months ago. He needs to understand that clearly before anything else is discussed between us." Freya studied her with evident pride, recognizing the remarkable strength and clarity that had grown within Elena over their months together. "I have no doubt he will understand that immediately," Freya said. "You carry yourself very differently now than the woman who first wandered into our territory, Elena. Whatever he came seeking, I suspect he will find someone considerably more formidable than he anticipated." Elena took a deep, steadying breath, drawing on every ounce of hard-won strength and confidence she had cultivated during her months at Ashgrove, and made her way toward the settlement's perimeter, toward the confrontation that would finally force her to fully reconcile the devastating pain of the past with whatever uncertain future still remained possible between herself and the king who had once claimed her as his fated mate, only to reject her before the entire assembled might of the Northern Territories. Draven's breath caught the moment Elena stepped out from the tree line, and for a long moment, he simply stared, struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the memory he had carried through 6 agonizing months of regret and declining health. She stood taller than he remembered, her posture radiating a quiet confidence that had been notably absent during their final devastating conversation beneath the old oak tree. Her eyes, when they finally met his, carried none of the desperate hope he remembered from the night of their bonding, replaced instead by something steadier, more guarded, and unmistakably stronger. "Elena," he said, her name escaping him like something precious he had feared he might never speak aloud again. "Your Majesty," Elena replied, her voice carrying deliberate formality that struck him with the force of a physical blow, a stark reminder of exactly how much distance remained between them, despite the desperate hope that had carried him across difficult territory in his weakened condition. They stood facing each other for a long, charged moment, the small traveling party and settlement guards maintaining careful distance to allow whatever conversation followed some measure of privacy. Draven took in the full extent of her transformation, noting the confident strength in her stance, the steady clarity in her gaze, and felt a complicated mixture of admiration and renewed guilt settle over him. She had clearly rebuilt herself into someone remarkable during their months apart, and he could not escape the crushing awareness that this transformation had occurred entirely without him, born from the devastating wound his rejection had inflicted upon her. "You look well," Draven said finally, uncertain how else to begin a conversation he had rehearsed countless times during his journey, without ever finding words adequate to the weight of what needed to be said. "I am well," Elena confirmed. "Considerably more well than I was 6 months ago, no thanks to you." The rebuke landed exactly as sharply as she had intended, and Draven absorbed it without flinching, recognizing the full justice of her anger, even as it cut through him with renewed pain. "I know," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I put you through, Elena, and I have spent every day since that devastating gathering wrestling with the full weight of that knowledge." "Then why are you here?" Elena asked, her voice carrying genuine challenge rather than the softness he might once have expected from her. Draven took a steadying breath, drawing on every ounce of honesty he had promised himself he would bring to this confrontation, regardless of how difficult that honesty proved to deliver. "I am here because I made a devastating mistake," he said. I allowed fear and political calculation to override something genuine and rare, something the elders now tell me occurs only once in many generations of our kind. I convinced myself that duty demanded I sacrifice you for the sake of my kingdom's stability, and instead, I discovered that the sacrifice accomplished nothing beyond destroying what mattered most, while leaving me slowly dying from a wound I inflicted upon myself through my own cowardice. Elena's expression flickered at his admission, something complicated moving behind her guarded eyes, though she maintained her careful composure. You are dying? The healers believe the bond wound, left unresolved, will eventually prove fatal, Draven said honestly. Though I did not travel here seeking your pity, Elena, nor do I ask you to consider reconciliation simply to save my own life. I came because I owe you a genuine explanation and a genuine apology, regardless of whatever you ultimately decide to do with either. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his words carefully, recognizing the raw honesty in his voice, even as she maintained the protective distance she had promised herself she would preserve throughout whatever conversation followed. Then explain, she said finally. Tell me honestly, without political language or careful diplomatic framing, exactly why you believed rejecting me was the only path available to you. And so Draven told her everything, standing there at the edge of the Ashgrove settlement with his weakened body and his desperate honesty laid bare before her. He told her about the crushing weight of inheriting his throne at 25, about watching his own father die from poison delivered by enemies who had sensed vulnerability and struck without mercy. He told her about 7 years spent believing that duty and personal happiness could never coexist for a king in his position, about the fear that had shaped nearly every significant decision of his reign. He told her about Edmund's warnings, about General Callum's concerns for the safety of the Pax, about Garrick's calculated manipulation of the political crisis their bonding had inadvertently created. None of that excuses what I did, Draven said finally, his voice carrying genuine anguish. I understand that clearly now, in a way I did not allow myself to fully understand during those difficult weeks leading up to the gathering. I told myself I was protecting my kingdom, but in truth, I was simply afraid of vulnerability, afraid of losing control, afraid of becoming a king whose enemies could exploit his own heart against him. I sacrificed you to that fear, and I have spent every day since regretting that decision more deeply than I believed myself capable of regretting anything. Elena remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, processing the full weight of his admission, and Draven forced himself to wait, resisting the desperate urge to fill the silence with further pleading or justification. This confrontation belonged to Elena now, and he understood, with a clarity that had been notably absent during the crucial weeks before the gathering, that whatever came next depended entirely on her response, not his desperate hope. I spent months believing I would never fully recover from what you did to me, Elena said finally, her voice carrying quiet steadiness despite the visible emotion beneath the surface. The physical pain alone was more devastating than anything I had ever experienced. But the emotional wound cut even deeper, Draven, because for one brief, precious night, you made me believe that perhaps I was worth claiming, worth protecting, worth choosing above every other consideration. And then you stood before an entire assembly of pack leaders and confirmed everything my mother had spent 6 years telling me, that I was not worth the risk, that my value could be calculated and found insufficient when weighed against political necessity. I know, Draven said quietly, unable to fully mask the anguish her words stirred within him. I know exactly how devastating that must have felt, and I carry the full weight of causing it, regardless of whatever explanation I offer. But I did not simply collapse under that devastation, Elena continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I rebuilt myself, Draven, piece by careful piece, far from the judgment and cruelty that had defined my entire existence before that night. I discovered strength within myself that I had spent 6 years being told did not exist, strength that had nothing to do with your recognition or your rejection, strength that belongs entirely to me, regardless of whatever happens between us now. Draven felt something shift powerfully within his chest at her words, a complicated mixture of profound admiration and renewed grief at everything she had been forced to rebuild alone, without any support from the man who should have stood beside her through the devastating aftermath of his own decision. You have every right to send me away, he said quietly. I would understand completely if that is your decision, Elena. I did not come here expecting forgiveness, only hoping to offer the honesty I failed to provide before. Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her guarded expression softened slightly, though her posture remained steady and resolute. I have thought often, these past months, about what I would say if our paths ever crossed again, she admitted. I imagined confronting you with every bit of anger and devastation your rejection caused me. I imagined demanding that you understand exactly how much damage your decision inflicted, not just upon me, but upon everyone who has ever been told their worth could be calculated and found wanting by the people who claim to care for them. You deserve to say all of that, Draven said, and more. Perhaps, Elena said. But standing here now, seeing you weakened and genuinely remorseful, I find myself less interested in demanding punishment than in understanding what genuine change, if any, has come from everything you have suffered these past months. Draven considered her question carefully, recognizing the genuine importance of his answer. I have learned, he said slowly, that the strength I spent 7 years cultivating, the careful control and unshakable authority I believed essential to my reign, was ultimately hollow, without the courage to protect what genuinely mattered, rather than simply what appeared politically convenient. I have learned that duty and personal integrity are not opposing forces, Elena, but rather two halves of the same responsibility, and that a king who sacrifices his own heart in the name of duty ultimately fails the very people he claims to protect, because a hollow king cannot lead with genuine wisdom or courage. Elena felt something loosen slightly in her chest at his words, recognizing genuine growth rather than simple, desperate pleading born from his declining health. That is a significant change from the man who stood before that assembly 6 months ago, she observed. It cost me nearly everything to learn it, Draven admitted. I do not ask you to simply forget what happened, Elena, or to pretend the devastating consequences of my decision did not fundamentally change both our lives. I ask only for the opportunity to prove, through genuine action rather than empty words, that I have learned what true strength actually requires. Elena remained silent for a long moment, weighing his words against everything she had rebuilt within herself over the past 6 months, recognizing that whatever she decided now would fundamentally shape the remainder of her own future, regardless of the outcome. She thought of Freya's earlier counsel, that she owed him nothing, regardless of the political or magical consequences he continued to suffer. She thought, too, of the genuine growth and strength she had cultivated within herself, strength that no longer depended on his approval or rejection to feel complete. I will not return to Ravenswood Hall as though nothing happened, Elena said finally, her voice carrying quiet but unmistakable authority. If there is to be any reconciliation between us, it will happen on terms that reflect exactly who I have become during these past 6 months, not the frightened, uncertain woman you once rejected. I will not be paraded before pack leaders as a political solution to your declining health, nor will I simply resume the role of grateful mate as though your devastating decision never occurred. I would not ask that of you, Draven said quietly. Whatever reconciliation might eventually be possible between us, Elena, I understand it must be built upon genuine mutual respect, not upon my desperate need for healing alone. Then we begin there, Elena said, with honesty, and with the clear understanding that I enter any future between us as an equal, not as someone whose worth requires your validation to feel complete. Something shifted in Draven's expression at her words, a complicated mixture of relief and renewed hope, tempered by genuine humility. I would be honored to build something between us, on exactly those terms, he said. Freya, who had maintained careful distance throughout the difficult conversation, stepped forward now, her sharp gaze studying both Elena and Draven with evident consideration. Elena, she said, whatever you decide, know that you will always have a place within these walls, regardless of what path you choose to walk forward. Elena felt a rush of gratitude toward the woman who had offered her genuine belonging and guidance during the most difficult months of her life. Thank you, Freya, she said, for everything you have taught me, and for the home you offered when I had nowhere else to turn. Over the following days, as Draven's traveling party remained encamped near the edge of the Ashgrove settlement, Elena and Draven spent considerable time in careful, honest conversation, slowly rebuilding something between them that bore little resemblance to the desperate, uncertain bond that had first formed beneath the mating moon 6 months earlier. This new understanding was built instead upon genuine mutual respect, upon Draven's demonstrated humility and Elena's hard-won strength, upon honest acknowledgement of everything that had been lost and everything that remained possible to rebuild between them. When Elena finally agreed to attempt a reversal of the rejection, performed with the careful guidance of Alric, who had traveled to Ashgrove himself upon learning of the king's location, she did so, not as the frightened, hopeful young woman who had once stood beside Draven beneath the silver moon, but as someone who understood clearly her own worth, someone who chose reconciliation not from desperate need, but from genuine consideration of what a partnership built on equal strength and mutual respect might offer them both. The reversal ritual, performed quietly within the Ashgrove settlement rather than before an assembly of watching pack leaders, restored the bond between them with the same undeniable intensity that had first drawn them together, though this time, Elena felt none of the desperate uncertainty that had accompanied their initial bonding. She felt instead a quiet, grounded certainty, the strength of a woman who had rebuilt herself entirely, and now chose partnership from a place of genuine wholeness rather than desperate need. Word of their reconciliation eventually reached Ravenswood Hall, and eventually reached Elena's mother as well, though Elena chose to address that particular reckoning on her own careful terms, months later, when she finally felt ready to confront Mirren directly about the cruelty that had shaped so much of her early life. That confrontation, when it finally occurred, carried none of the desperate need for approval that had once defined Elena's relationship with her mother, replaced instead by calm, unflinching honesty about the damage Mirren's cruelty had caused, and the genuine strength Elena had ultimately built for herself, far from her mother's harsh judgment. Alpha Garrick's political maneuvering, deprived of the vulnerability he had sought to exploit, gradually lost its momentum as Draven's health fully recovered and his authority as king reasserted itself with renewed strength, tempered now by a genuine wisdom and humility that had been notably absent during the earlier years of his reign. The northern territories, rather than fracturing under the pressure Garrick had hoped to exploit, found themselves governed by a king who understood, at last, that true strength required both unwavering duty and the courage to protect what genuinely mattered, regardless of political convenience. Elena Voss, the daughter once publicly declared destined to die alone and mateless, ultimately built a life defined not by her mother's cruel prophecy, nor by the devastating rejection she had once suffered before an entire assembly of pack leaders, but by the genuine strength and identity she had discovered within herself, far from anyone else's judgment or expectation. She stood eventually beside King Draven Ashford, not as a fragile, uncertain young woman, grateful for his belated recognition, but as an equal partner whose worth had never truly depended on his approval, a woman who had transformed devastating rejection into the foundation of unshakable self-worth, proving, in the end, that her mother's cruel prophecy had been wrong from the very beginning, and that true strength was never about being chosen by someone else, but about choosing, finally and completely, to believe in one's own worth, regardless of anyone else's judgment.